Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. When I was about 12 years old, my family and I lived in a cabin on 5 acres of land. The property had been abandoned and taken over by squatters before we moved in, so there was a lot of work to do. It was actually a lot of fun fixing it up together as a family. At first, I loved the house. There were plenty of places to explore, and the biggest things I had to worry about were the occasional spiders, snakes, and mice that would sneak into our home. But that was before I started seeing things. It began with just a quick glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something dark, tall, and thin running down the hallway while I sat on the couch. At first I brushed it off, but then it started happening more often. I would catch sight of a dark figure standing in the distance or peeking at me from behind objects, always in my peripheral vision. Each time I turned to look, it would vanish instantly. It felt like it was playing with me, teasing me. Slowly, a feeling of dread crept in, as if something was watching me, waiting for its chance to strike. But the worst night, the night I will never forget, is what led me to tell this story. One evening, after staying up late playing Minecraft with my friends online, I decided to watch a movie and fall asleep on the couch. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up unexpectedly. The moment I opened my eyes, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, and I knew something was terribly wrong. As I lay there frozen in the dark, I could hear my parents in the room next to me, and unfortunately for me, they were having sex. That uncomfortable moment lasted only a few minutes, but the intense fear that I had woken up with remained. Every part of me was screaming not to move, not to make a sound. It felt as if something was in the house, waiting for me. That is when I heard it. From the kitchen, a growl echoed through the room, and it called my name. The voice had a threatening, mocking tone, as if it were saying, "I am going to get you." My blood ran cold, and my entire body felt like it was tingling with static. I could barely breathe. That growl was so distinct, raspy, deep, and croaky, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I shut my eyes tightly, trembling and praying to fall asleep. I was so terrified that I honestly believe I might die that night. Somehow, the overwhelming fear must have acted as a defense mechanism, because I managed to fall asleep quickly. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. Together, we decided to bless the house and cast out whatever presence was lurking there. We anointed every door with oil, sage, every room, and firmly declared that whatever was in the house did not belong. Surprisingly, it seemed to work. Things felt different after that. Years later, I learned something disturbing. My father had been involved in some truly evil things while we lived in that house. I do not want to go into the nasty details, but he is no longer a part of my life. I believe that whatever darkness he brought into our home attracted those evil beings. His actions invited that darkness into our lives, and we had no idea at the time. Back in 2016, I was in a long-term relationship with a girl whose family lived in a small town in Connecticut. We had been dating for over a year, and while I had met her parents a few times, this was the first time I would be staying at her childhood home. I was a little nervous about making a good impression, but she assured me everything would be fine. The drive down was beautiful, with scenic views of the countryside, and the town itself was like a classic colonial postcard. We pulled up to her family's house, a 3-story old home sitting on a hill overlooking a large green yard. It was a lovely, cozy place, clearly well maintained despite its age. Her parents welcomed us warmly, leading us through the front door into a spacious foyer with a dark wooden staircase. The house had a charming, old New England feel, with some modern updates mixed in. My girlfriend told me we would be sleeping in the guest room upstairs because her childhood bedroom only had a single bed. Then she casually mentioned that the house was sort of haunted and that the guest room was where most of the ghostly activity happened. I was caught off guard and asked her what she meant by that. She said her brother had experienced weird stuff while staying in that room, but she didn't go into detail, clearly trying not to freak me out. She did mention that everyone in her family had experienced something strange in the house at one time or another. Her father, for example, had a strange encounter while remodeling the kitchen. He was home alone, taking a break and drinking some water, and he suddenly felt a strong hand grip his right shoulder. He jumped up, startled, but when he looked around, no one was there. He was not a superstitious guy, but he believed the spirit was warning him against making changes to the house. Another time, my girlfriend was home alone watching TV downstairs when she heard loud footsteps echoing down the hall upstairs. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by banging on the walls, slowly approaching the top of the staircase. Her dog ran to the bottom of the stairs, barking wildly. Grabbing her phone and the dog, she ran outside, terrified, and called her parents and the police. She watched the house from the sidewalk, where she could see both entrances. The police searched the house but found nothing. Her family dismissed it as another ghostly encounter. There were other small, eerie occurrences, too, like the attic door closing on its own. No matter what they did, even placing a chair in front of the door, it would always be closed when they came back downstairs. That part bothered me the most, and I made up my mind to avoid going up to the attic at all costs. My experience, however, happened on our first night staying there. We settled down in the guest room to sleep, and I remember feeling uneasy about the lighting in the room. It was strange both to bright and to dim at the same time. I thought maybe I was just tired and brushed it off as we climbed into bed. In the middle of the night, I had the most vivid and horrifying dream I have ever experienced. A woman appeared, furious and filled with rage, and she started speaking to me directly. She showed me people I loved, my girlfriend, my family, my friends, and she was torturing them. She was shoving broken glass into their gums, scraping it against their teeth, and all I could do was watch, frozen in terror. She told me that she would torture and kill everyone I cared about and swore that what she was showing me was real. I struggled to wake up, fighting against the grip this woman had on me. For a brief moment, I managed to open my eyes, but somehow she followed me into my waking state. Still in the dream, she screamed at me, "You will never escape." I jolted awake for real this time, sitting upright in bed, screaming and shaking uncontrollably. My girlfriend woke up, alarmed, and tried to calm me down, asking what had happened. I was so shaken, I started crying as I tried to explain what I had just seen and how horrifyingly real it felt. She reassured me that it was just a nightmare, and eventually I started to calm down. Although I was scared to go back to sleep, somehow we both managed to drift off again, and nothing else happened that night. We stayed in the guest room a few more times after that, and I never had another dream like it. I still do not know what to make of that night. Maybe it was just my brain playing tricks on me, triggered by the stories I had heard about the room being haunted. Or perhaps it was the house itself, trying to warn me. Whatever the reason, I have never had a dream that intense before or since, and I can confidently say that I am never going back to Connecticut. When I was in high school, I moved to a suburb in a big city. Even though most of the area looked like a suburb, there were still some parts that felt like the countryside. One thing I really disliked about this place was the poor lighting. There weren't many street lights, so it was always very dark at night. My house was at the corner of a street and an avenue. My house faced the main street, which was a few miles long and went to many neighborhoods in the area. The avenue where my house was ran perpendicular to the main street, was about a quarter of a mile long, and had only about 6 houses. The avenue was mostly made of gravel. At the end of the avenue, the gravel stopped, and there were thick bushes and trees. These eventually led to a state forest. At that time, I was dating a girl who lived in the area. To walk to and from her house, I would go down the main street and walk all the way to the end. The end of the street led to a small field. Walking through the field, you would come to a wooden fence. This fence separated the backyards of many houses, including her house, from the field. One night, after leaving her house, I realized it was much later than I thought. It was after midnight, and we had school the next day, so I wanted to get home and sleep. After she locked the fence door and went inside, I turned around and started walking back through the field. As I mentioned before, there were almost no lights in this area night, so I decided to walk in the middle of the main street instead of on the sidewalk. This way I could use the moonlight and see my surroundings better. Walking in the middle of the street also meant I could avoid walking too close to trees. I was getting closer to my house and was approaching the part I called the black hole. I called this area the last half mile of my house the black hole because it was the darkest part of my journey home. There were no street lights and mostly trees on both sides. After entering the black hole, I started hearing a strange sound. It was too far away to hear clearly, and I thought it might just be an animal. So I didn't think much of it and kept walking. I could see a car coming from a distance, so I quickly moved to the sidewalk, waited for the car to pass, and then went back to the middle of the street. After walking for about a minute, I heard the sound again. This time I realized it was getting louder, so I decided to walk faster. As I was getting closer to my house, I listened for the sound to figure out where it was coming from. The longer I listened, the louder it got. Finally, the sound was so loud that I could clearly hear someone taking deep breaths. I was terrified. I knew whatever was making the sound was very close to me, but I decided not to look back until I got closer to my house. That way I could use the light from the only street light in this area at the corner of my house. I could hear the breathing getting louder and louder until I finally reached the street light. I finally gathered the courage to turn around, and I was shocked by what I saw. When I turned around, there was a man right behind me, not on the sidewalk or on one side of the road. He was so close to my back that if he tripped, he would have knocked me over. I looked into his eyes, and he looked into mine. Then he suddenly moved around me and ran down the avenue where I lived, disappearing into the darkness. If you're still reading, thank you. I have a few more scary stories that I don't mind sharing if anyone is interested. I promise this is a true story, though no one seems to believe me. I cannot explain it any other way. When I was 11 years old, my family and I went camping in the mountains. We set up in a small open area deep in the forest, surrounded by trees. It was a family trip with my sister, parents, grandparents, cousins, and a few friends with their parents. We had two tents and one RV. My family slept in one tent that had a side connected to the tent where my dogs stayed. There was also a nearby toilet tent. My friends and their parents had a tent behind ours, and my grandparents and cousins stayed in the RV. In total, there were 12 of us, including me. Besides us, there was only one other RV with a dog and a tent a few rows down with a couple in it. It was a pretty big campsite, so there was a lot of space between all of us. My family was the closest to the woods, though not so close that we could see into it, but we could see about 5 feet past the tree line. It was a 2-week trip, and we had 5 days left before heading home. Around 3 a.m. I was still awake because I had forgotten my insomnia medication at home, and I had slept until 2 p.m. that day. I needed to use the bathroom, but was too scared to go out alone, so I woke up my dad. He did not want to leave the tent, but promised to watch from the windows until I came back. So I grabbed a lamp and headed to the toilet tent. Once inside, I closed the flap and turned off the lamp, which I always do to keep bugs from being attracted and to avoid anyone seeing me. Not even a minute later, my dogs, who were in the tent next to the bathroom, started barking and growling like crazy. They never bark unless someone comes too close to the tent or during rare moments, like when geese wandered between the tents once. It was late, and I could not hear anyone outside. My dad started yelling at them to be quiet, but they only got louder. Even our golden retriever, who was always calm, started barking with this terrifying tone. Our other dog was growling as if it was ready to attack something. It was so unnerving. I was scared, but I wanted to know if there was something outside that I needed to tell my dad about. So I opened the entrance to the tent just slightly to see what was happening. I looked out into the woods, trying to spot any animals, but saw nothing at first. Then, off to the left, I noticed something moving behind the trees. Once my eyes focused, I could see a large figure much bigger than a human walking along the tree line. It was not coming into the camp, just walking past it. Its arms were so long that they seemed to drag on the ground, and it appeared to have a long snout on its face. The creature's eyes reflected the light from the RV nearby, glowing an eerie red. It looked like it had huge antlers on its head and moved in an unsettlingly smooth way, almost like it was floating. My dad, frustrated by the dogs barking, opened the part of the tent connected to theirs, and the dogs ran into the main tent. The creature did not seem to react to the nose, but turned and walked back into the woods, away from our camp. As it left, the dogs calmed down and stopped barking, acting like nothing had happened. It took me 5 minutes to finally feel my heart beating again. My dad called out, asking if I was okay, and I told him I was before going back inside. I could not sleep at all that night. The next morning at breakfast, I told everyone what I had seen, but no one believed me. My grandpa said I was probably just tired and imagining things, or I might have seen a deer in the dark and mistaken it for something else. After breakfast, the other kids my age and I went to the tree line where I had seen a creature a few hours earlier. There were hoof prints in the dirt and signs of something being dragged. Further into the trees, there was a tree with huge, deep marks that looked fresh and unnatural. My grandpa said it was probably a deer rubbing its antlers on the tree, but it did not look like that to me. After that, I refused to go to the bathroom at night and struggled even more with sleep. 2 days later, my friends and I convinced my grandpa to come with us to investigate further into the tree line. We showed him the marks, though the tracks had faded by then. He said it looked more like a coyote had dug its claws into the tree. As we went deeper into the forest, and it got darker. My grandpa told us to stay where we were, and he walked ahead. After about 5 minutes, he came back and said we were going back to camp. When we returned, he quietly told us he had found 2 more trees marked like the one he had shown him, and a dead fox. The strange thing, he said, was that the fox had not been eaten. It was marked like the trees, but a large part of its side had been torn off and tossed a distance away. He looked disturbed, but said it was probably a coyote that got into a fight and left it. That was when I knew what I had seen was real. After that, I refused to sleep in the tent and spent the rest of the trip sleeping on the couch in my grandparents' RV. We no longer camp at that site after a couple was found dead there 3 weeks later. I moved around a lot as a kid because of my dad's job. We never stayed in one place for too long, which meant new schools, new friends, and sometimes new homes that didn't quite feel right. It wasn't until much later in life that I realized just how strange some of those places were. When I was in 3rd grade, we moved to Wausau, Wisconsin. It was 1970, and we only stayed there for 6 months, but those 6 months were unforgettable. I kept seeing things move in my room and hearing voices, whispers that seemed to float through the air but had no source. My parents brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and banning me from watching Night Gallery, as if that show was the cause of my troubles. But the strange things didn't stop. 30 years later, my mom casually dropped a bombshell on me. Someone had died in my room. Suddenly, all those nights of hearing things made perfect, chilling sense. After Wausau, we moved back to Appleton. This time we lived in a house for about 6 months before my parents had a falling out with the landlady. The weird part was that I ended up back at my old school, Sacred Heart. I even ended up in the same class with the same teacher, Mrs. Hoffman. It felt like stepping into a time warp, as if I hadn't moved away at all. We soon moved across town to 1213 E. Francis Street in 1972. This house didn't last long for us either, a year, maybe. My family was growing, and the small ranch-style house was just too cramped. My sister Amy started talking about a man in the basement, and sure enough, we would hear footsteps coming up the stairs at night, slow and deliberate. Playing in the basement always gave me the creeps, and even my friends felt the same unease when they came over. It wasn't until years later that my parents told us the truth. Someone had committed suicide in that basement. Then came the move down the street to 1301 E. Francis in 1973. This house had its own unsettling atmosphere. Our parents' bedroom was downstairs, while the 3 of us kids had rooms upstairs. My brother's room was always colder than the rest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then I played with my chemistry set in my dad's workshop. Lights would flicker constantly, and the kitchen seemed to have a life of its own. Cupboard doors would slam shut without anyone near them. Objects would move, and sometimes things just vanished. We kids would race downstairs to grab something from the pantry or the deep freezer, and every time we'd tear back upstairs like something was chasing us. Our parents dismissed it as childish imagination, even though we'd all experienced it. My sister Sarah started seeing a little girl with red eyes standing next to her bed at night. She said she saw the same girl near the downstairs closet. My brother confirmed that he'd felt something sit on his bed at night and had seen the girl too. We stayed in that house until 1978, but none of us ever fully adjusted to the strange things that happened there years later. In the 2000s, I lived with 2 guys in a condo in Reno, I knew from the start that something wasn't right, but my roommates didn't believe me. My silky terrier, Ziggy, would stand on my bed in the middle of the night, whimpering and growling at something I couldn't see. We all heard footsteps going up and down the stairs, but my roommates brushed it off until one night, when everything changed. One of my roommates, John, wanted tickets to one of my stage hypnotist shows to impress a date. He spent the entire show texting, and afterward he rushed home, saying that our other roommate, Dominic, was freaking out. Apparently, Dominic had heard something in my room, and Ziggy had been growling at my closet. When Dominic challenged the spirit like they do on those ghost hunting shows, he heard a crash. He snapped a picture, and there it was, a clear image of something that shouldn't have been there. Things escalated from there. Dominic's challenge had stirred something up, and we ended up calling in 3 different ghost hunters. Each one told us the same story. There was a young boy and girl who liked my dog, but there was also a dark man. Even Terry Landry from the news came out with her ghost hunting team, and they confirmed it too. Something dark was in the house, but that wasn't the end of it. I was doing long distance with a woman from Pittsburgh who had some psychic abilities. One night, we had dinner at my friends Cheryl and Dave's place, and after dinner, their dogs started barking and the parrot began squawking like something was in the house. Cheryl just shrugged and said, "It's our ghosts." We investigated, captured some EVPs, and even caught orbs flying around in the photos we took. When we got back home, the woman and I both had this feeling like someone had walked over our graves. I'd only felt that way once before. She turned to me and said that the ghost from Cheryl's house had followed us home. Without hesitation, she saged the entire house, cleansing it from whatever had latched onto us. I've lived in a lot of places, but some of them stay with you in more ways than one. I was only 20 when I had my first truly terrifying experience in my grandmother's house. It was a sunny afternoon, and I was vacuuming the hallway right in front of the yellow room that would later become infamous in our family. I didn't know it then, but it was the room where my uncle would die from a heart attack, found lying with his eyes wide open, just inches from the closet. As I moved the vacuum back and forth, I suddenly felt a tap on my shoulder, followed by a distinct gust of air that blew through my hair, making it fly into my face. I froze. My grandmother was the only other person home, and she was wheelchair-bound in the kitchen, far too devout and serious to pull a prank on me. I knew then that something was very wrong in that house, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The truth is, my history with that yellow room started years before, about 3 years earlier. Before my family had fully moved into the house, I had taken a break from helping them paint. I laid on the floor of that same room reading a book with my head facing the door. My dad had just gone out to the car or garage, leaving me completely alone in the house, or so I thought. Moments after he left, the door to the yellow room slammed shut with such force that it made me jump. I looked up from my book, and there, hanging in the closet to the right of the door, was a red-headed woman. She was just hanging there, her lifeless body swaying slightly in the eerie silence. I was frozen in terror, unable to scream, unable to move. 6 years later, my uncle had a heart attack in that very room, and my grandmother found him lying with his eyes wide open, right in front of that closet. My grandmother passed away for years after my uncle, in the room next to the yellow room. It was shortly before she died that she asked me a question that still haunts me to this day. She asked if I ever felt the need to call upon Jesus while I was in her house. I wasn't religious, but I knew what she was asking. She wanted to know if I had ever felt unsafe or afraid. I told her about the red-headed woman I had seen in the closet all those years ago. Her face drained of color, her eyes wide with fear as she leaned in and whispered, "The red-headed woman runs naked through my room screaming." When I tried to sleep after that, we prayed together, and we never spoke of it again. When my sister and her kids moved into the house after my grandmother's health began to decline, the kids were offered the yellow room. They didn't know anything about what I had seen or what had happened to our uncle, but they refused to stay in that room. They were terrified of even walking down the hallway toward it. My sister stayed in the room for a while, and during that time she sank into a deep depression. Eventually, my nephew, now a preteen, worked up the courage to move into the room. He says the door still closes on its own, but it doesn't slam shut like it used to. Oddly enough, my niece never talked about the red-headed woman, but was instead terrorized by a pale, black-haired woman who appeared in the hallway bathroom. She's the only person in the house who's mentioned seeing this dark-haired figure, but the fear in her eyes when she talks about it is all too real. One day, while vacuuming, my mind tried to rationalize the gust of wind that blew my hair into my face. Maybe it was the air conditioner kicking back on, I told myself. But when I checked the thermostat, the AC wasn't even running. The fan wasn't on either. There was no logical explanation for what had happened. There was another incident I can't quite place in the timeline, but it stands out vividly. I was hanging out with my aunt in her room, which was down the same hallway, but at the opposite end from the yellow room. We were chatting when, out of nowhere, her ponytail flew forward over her head and slapped her in the face. I watched it happen. Her head didn't move, and there was no way she could have done it herself. It was as if someone had lifted her hair from behind and flung it over her. Despite all these experiences, we never had the house cleansed. My grandmother was a devout Christian, but by the time they moved to Virginia, she didn't belong to a local church community, and we never sought any spiritual help. One of the scariest moments happened on the 4th of July after my uncle had passed. I was using the restroom near the dining room, on the opposite end of the house from the bedrooms and the hallway. Everyone else was outside, either grilling or getting the fireworks ready. As I sat there, I distinctly heard my late uncle's voice call my name. His voice was unmistakable, deep, unsettling, and full of menace. I was terrified of him when he was alive, and the fear lingered after his death. He had been an addict, prone to violent outbursts and erratic behavior. Recently, my mom told me something that sent chills down my spine. When they still lived in New York, my uncle used to write me letters. At the time, I was too young to read or write, but that didn't stop him from sending increasingly disturbing letters, asking why I never wrote back, why I didn't want to play with him. He said it made him angry, and I'm grateful my mom didn't tell me about this until after he had passed. I shared some of these stories with my niece, and she said that whenever they talk about the house and what they've seen, the lights flicker. She also had a dream where our grandmother came back, but she looked different. Her hair was red again. My grandmother used to color her hair red when she was younger. That detail alone shook me to my core. The yellow room and the house itself hold too many memories, and not all of them are the kind you want to remember. I must have been in middle school when this all happened, right before the start of a new school year. My second cousin had just moved into a new apartment, 2 stories, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. It was a pretty nice place, a big kitchen, spacious living room, and it seemed perfect for her then boyfriend, and her baby. She invited me and my older sibling to spend the night, and although Mom wanted to stay home, she came by to check out the apartment. We were all impressed. The complex was right by the school, and even though there were a few questionable neighbors, the place had a good feel to it, at least at first. My cousin was proud of it, happy to have her own space, and we were happy for her too. The neighborhood kids came by while my mom and cousin were talking. My sister and I struck up a conversation with them, talking about toys, games, and the usual kid stuff. One older kid gave a glance toward the apartment and chuckled. "Can't believe y'all moved in here, man." I remember when that old lady. Before he could finish, my cousin quickly walked over and cut him off, telling the kids it was time to leave. We didn't think much of it. We said goodbye to our mom and went inside. It was just me, my sibling, my cousin, and her baby after that. I forgot all about what the boy had started to say as we got caught up playing video games and messing around with the baby. That night, though, things took a strange turn. It was quiet. Too quiet. The TV was on, but muted. My cousin was asleep in her bed with the baby, and my sibling and I were laying on the floor with blankets and sheets. Something woke me up. I sat up, looking around the room, but everything seemed normal. Everyone was still asleep. So what woke me up? I stretched out, trying to get comfortable again, when I heard it thump, 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 The sound was subtle but steady, and I could feel the vibrations through the thin blankets. My sibling was awake, too, staring at me. "You heard it, too?" They whispered. I nodded, lowering my head so we wouldn't wake my cousin. "How long has it been going on?" I asked. "I don't know," they replied, "but it woke me up." I didn't say anything because our cousin hasn't reacted. We both glanced at the closed bedroom door. My cousin's boyfriend wasn't home. He was out with friends, so it wasn't him making the noise. That's when I asked, "Should we wake her up?" Before my sibling could respond, my cousin's sleepy voice cut through the darkness. "Be quiet and go back to sleep." We both flinched. I sat up quickly, only to see that my cousin was still laying down, eyes closed. "I was just thinking about going to the bathroom," I lied, not wanting to admit I was curious about the noise. She sighed, telling me to hurry up. My siblings shot me a nervous look. They didn't want me to open the door, but I was younger and braver, or maybe just dumber, so I walked over and cracked the door open. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, I felt it. The cold, not just from the hardwood floor beneath my feet, but the entire apartment was freezing except for the warmth of my cousin's room. The bathroom was just a few steps away, but from where I stood I could see down the stairs to the front door. I paused, watching the moonlight spill in through the small window in the door, creating a soft, dim glow on the floor. The rest of the apartment was pitch dark and eerily still. I waited, expecting something, anything to move, but nothing did. My cousin called me back, irritated. I quickly ducked into the bathroom, flushed the toilet to make it seem like I'd really gone, washed my hands, and headed back to the bedroom. As soon as I shut the door behind me, thump, thump, thump. The sound was faster now, like footsteps rushing up the stairs. My heart raced as I glanced at my cousin, who was still awake, watching me go back to sleep. She muttered. And that's exactly what we did, pretending nothing was wrong. The next morning, our mom came to pick us up. As we were getting ready to leave, my cousin tried to convince us to stay longer. Mom refused, saying we had school the next day. After some back and forth, Mom finally asked, "Why do you want them to stay so badly? Isn't your boyfriend working?" My cousin hesitated, her face turning pale. "He's working, but I miss you all. I want to spend more time with you." Mom wasn't buying it. "What's the real reason?" She pressed. After a long pause, my cousin finally sighed. an old lady died in the apartment. They found her at the bottom of the stairs in her nightgown, but she didn't fall. It seemed like she died trying to go up the stairs. I remember seeing the ambulance when I was driving by one time, but I didn't know it was this apartment. My mom shook her head immediately. "You're not staying here," she said firmly. "Neither are my kids. No one wanted to stay in that apartment. Not my aunt, not my cousin's sister, not even her boyfriend. He started taking overtime at work just to avoid coming home. Within days, they moved out and found another place in a different neighborhood years later. Another family member moved into that same complex. When I asked them about the old apartment, they just laughed and said, 'No one wants to live in there. Everyone says it's haunted.' I stayed quiet, nodding slowly. I didn't need anyone to convince me. The sound we heard that night, those footsteps coming up the stairs, has stayed with me ever since. And now that I'm writing this, I can't help but wonder, was it the old lady who haunted the apartment? Why is she still there? Maybe one day I'll drive through that neighborhood again. Maybe things have changed, but I'm not so sure." My childhood home, the house my parents bought in the early 1960s, had always intrigued me. Built during the war years, it was part of a neighborhood filled with small homes constructed to house war workers and their families. I had heard that a lot of people in the area, including my grandparents, had moved nearby for the same reason, working in war production. My parents were the second owners of this particular house. The first owners, a childless couple, bought it brand new in the 1940s, and even after selling it to my parents, they would occasionally stop by, visiting their old home. It was a modest house, the typical 3-bedroom, 1-bath kind of deal, sitting on a large enough lot that in the 1970s, my parents decided to expand. They added a family room, dining room, and extra closet space, and I was either just a baby or not born yet when this happened. The add-on was obvious. The original house was built on a raised foundation, while the new rooms were laid on a concrete pad, meaning there was a step down into the new section of the house. The add-on always had a strange vibe to it, but that wasn't the only weird thing. My dad had hired some guys to dig up the backyard and pour the new foundation. During the digging, they unearthed some odd items: old wood, strange metal pieces, fragments of pottery, and even bits of jewelry. My dad shrugged it off, but the discovery became family lore. As a kid in elementary school, I loved to dig in the backyard. Of course, my mom hated it. She would let me do almost anything else, but digging was off limits. One day, while playing with my Hot Wheels, I couldn't resist the urge. I wanted to create a dirt track, so I snuck around to the side of the house where my mom couldn't see me and started digging. That's when I found them small pieces of pottery, glass beads, and a weathered board that looked like it had been buried for ages. Before I could dig any deeper, my older brother found me and immediately told on me. My mom rushed outside, furious. She made me throw everything away, cover the dirt back up, and sternly warned me never to dig in that spot again. At the time, I didn't understand why she was so upset, but as I got older, things started to make a little more sense. There was something undeniably eerie about that house, specifically the add-on. No one in the family wanted to be in that part of the house alone. I remember one time, my cousin came to stay the night, and my mom made up the old sofa bed for him in the family room. It was one of those big, clunky pull-out beds from the 1980s. He didn't last the night. Around midnight, he crept into my room, dragging his blanket behind him, and ended up sleeping on the floor. He said he heard strange noises. We all did at one time or another. We'd hear scratching at the windows, weird thumping noises, and see shadows moving when there was no one there. Even though it was my home, I never played in the backyard at night. Something about it felt wrong, unsettling. The shadows seemed darker there. The year we moved away from that house was when I started to piece things together. I was older, more observant, and overheard my parents having a conversation that changed everything. They were discussing the possibility that there were unmarked graves on our land, graves that had never been discovered when the homes were built in the 1940s. The story went that, back in the 1800s, large plots of land in the area had been owned by dairy farmers. Eventually, the farmers moved on, and before the land was cleared for the wartime housing, it had been little more than open space. But before that, the area had a different name, and there were whispers that the land might have been used for burials, informal ones, where no markers were ever left behind. My parents weren't entirely sure, but there had always been rumors, and when those strange items were dug up during the construction of the add-on, it seemed to lend some weight to the idea. If the rumors are true, the home I grew up in, the house that I had lived in until I was in middle school, might have been sitting on land where people had been buried long before the house was even built. Thinking back on the strange things he experienced, the eerie noises, the shadows, and that unsettling feeling that never seemed to go away, I can't help but wonder if those unmarked graves had anything to do with it. Maybe there were spirits lingering, their rest disturbed by the construction, or perhaps the land itself had absorbed the energy of whatever was buried there. To this day, I still think about that house. We moved away, and the family that bought it never stayed long. Each time I drive by, the house looks a little more worn, a little more tired. I'm not sure what became of the things buried in the backyard. Maybe they're still there, waiting to be unearthed again, and maybe some things are better left buried. I have a big family, especially on my mom's side, and one of the closest branches is my aunt's family. She has 8 kids, and they live in this huge house on about 4 acres of land. Half of it is dense woods, though, so we could only really play on the acre of open yard. Despite that, we spent a lot of time in the woods, especially since we were homeschooled and had plenty of free time. It all started around 5 years ago, during one of those long summer days, when I was hanging out at my aunt's house like usual. My cousin, who was 15 at the time, and I had come inside as it was getting dark. The woods were pitch black without lights, and it was nearly impossible to see anything once the sun set. My sister and another cousin, who was 8 at the time, were still outside, playing near the edge of the woods. After a while, they suddenly burst through the basement door, pale as ghosts and breathing heavily. My cousin was crying uncontrollably, and my sister looked like she'd seen something terrifying, but neither of them could speak. We kept asking what was wrong, but they were too shaken to get the words out. Eventually, my cousin, still crying, managed to point out toward the tree line. Now, the basement door was a full glass panel, and if you stood up, you could see the entire yard. However, the yard was on a hill, so if you sat down, you could only see part of it. My older cousin and I stood up to look outside, and that's when we saw him, a man, standing just a feet away from the woods, wearing a white suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was completely obscured by the shadows, and it looked like he was wearing gloves. He didn't move, he just stood there, motionless, like he was watching us. We freaked out. Without saying a word, we bolted upstairs to find my aunt and uncle yelling about the man in the yard. By the time we got to the kitchen and convinced them to come check. He was gone, vanished without a trace. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there, but my cousin and I both knew what we saw, the man in the white suit. For a while, nothing else happened, but the memory of that night stayed with us. Then, about a year or two later, something strange happened again. My cousin, one of the younger sisters, who was 15 at the time, had moved into the basement room. It was a nice private space with a window that looked out onto the backyard, similar to the basement door. She had only been staying in the basement for about a week when she started having these dreams night after night. In the dreams, she felt like someone was watching her through the window. It made her uneasy, but she chalked it up to the natural creepiness of being alone in the basement. On the fourth night, something happened that freaked us all out. I was staying over that night with the oldest boy, and we were upstairs making popcorn at around 1 or 2 a.m., long after everyone had gone to bed. Suddenly, my cousin came running up the stairs, tears streaming down her face. She was crying and saying there was someone outside her window, watching her. She was 15, not a little kid, and she looked genuinely terrified. At first, we thought she might have been dreaming, since she was clearly half asleep, talking with her eyes barely open, but she was standing in the kitchen, fully aware of what she'd seen. My aunt came in, calmed her down, and took her back to bed. But that night, my cousin refused to sleep in the basement, and she moved out of the room entirely a few days later. Now, here's the weird part. Ever since then, we haven't had any other encounters like that. No more strange dreams. No one else seeing the man in the white suit. It's been quiet for years, but I can't shake the feeling that these two incidents, the man we saw near the woods and my cousin's experience in the basement, are connected. I don't know who or what that man was, but I do know one thing. He hasn't shown up again since. But the memory of his presence standing there in the yard watching us still sends chills down my spine. What do you think? Was it just some strange coincidence? Or was the white suit man something more than just a figment of our imagination? It was August 12th, 2022, a day that should have been just another shift at work. It was payday, and I was eager to finish my last shift before enjoying my 2-day rest. I remember feeling an odd sensation that day, something nagging at me, almost as if an invisible force was trying to stop me from going to work. I couldn't explain it, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was running late, and my work bag, for some reason, chose that exact moment to break. I had plenty of other bags to use, but I found myself standing there, unable to decide which one to take. It felt like I was being delayed on purpose. I quickly packed a change of clothes, my laptop, a few hygiene items, and everything else I needed. Then my coworker called. He was waiting for me at our usual meeting spot to give me a lift on his motorcycle. I hurried to meet him. As I climbed onto the bike, I realized I hadn't withdrawn any cash and didn't have my card on me, which was unusual for me. I had a strange vision of being in an accident as we passed by a large truck. It was fleeting, and I shook it off, thinking it was just my overactive imagination. We stopped at a gas station when it started to rain. My coworker, sensing the unease, suggested heading back home, but I insisted we keep going. Then it happened. A taxi swerved into our lane without signaling, and everything slowed down. The world around me moved in a strange, distorted way. I felt my heart sink as we collided. In that moment, I thought it was the end for me. A flurry of thoughts raced through my mind as I braced for impact. I remember accepting my fate, thinking that this was it, my life was about to end. But it didn't. When the crash was over, I was still alive, lying on the wet pavement with a deep laceration on my left foot. The wound was gruesome, my veins and cartilage exposed, but I survived. They rushed me to the hospital, and after 15 stitches, the doctors told me how lucky I was to be alive. For months after the accident, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I came to death that night. It haunted me, the idea that I somehow dodged a fate that felt inevitable. I even wonder if I had cheated death in some way, but I didn't think much beyond that is, until February 2023, when tragedy struck again. My coworker, the same one who had been with me during the accident, died in a multi-vehicle motorcycle crash. He was on his way to work, just like that fateful day in August. His wife, who was expecting their first child, was devastated. I cried for days. He was like a father to me, and I kept thinking, what if I had been with him that day? My friends told me it was a blessing in disguise that I hadn't been on his bike. Maybe I would have died. To doubt life seemed to move in a strange cycle of highs and lows. In April 2023, I met someone new. He was kind and gentle, everything I needed after the chaos of my past relationship. By June, I was pregnant, and for the first time in a long while, I felt genuinely happy. But then, on August 14th, 2023, almost exactly 1 year after the accident, I lost the baby. I was rushed to the hospital with sharp pains, and just like that, my happiness crumbled. I love that baby more than anything, and losing them felt like my heart had been ripped out. Now, it's August 2024, and I'm sick again. This time, I'm dealing with a cyst in my right breast, and surgery might be on the horizon. I can't shake the feeling that something bigger is at play, that each year in August, something life-altering happens to me. My mind keeps going back to that night in 2022, wondering if I somehow cheated death. Maybe I wasn't supposed to survive that crash. And now, each year, something else comes along to try and reclaim me. Is it just a coincidence, or is there some kind of pattern? I'm terrified of what August 2025 might bring. Will it be another loss, another close call? I feel trapped in this strange loop, wondering if I am slowly paying a debt for escaping death 2 years ago. I am desperate to break the chain, but I don't know how. How do you stop something that feels inevitable? Every August, I hold my breath, waiting to see what fate has in store for me next. I want to believe it's just bad luck, a series of unfortunate coincidences, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something far more sinister is at play. What do you think? Am I cursed, or is this all just a coincidence? How do I break free from this pattern before it's too late? This happened years ago, back when I was in middle school. We lived in an old, run-down house in a neighborhood that matched. It wasn't exactly a place you'd call welcoming, but it was home. Our backyard had a tall wooden fence, and the front and sides of the house were bordered by a simple white picket fence. For the first year, it was quite almost too quiet. We hardly ever saw or heard from our neighbors. Then the knocking started. At first, it was just an occasional sound at my window, soft enough that I thought I was imagining it, but it kept happening, night after night. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to the house's age, saying it was probably just settling noses or wind, but I knew it wasn't the house. I'm very spiritual, and back then I thought maybe the house was haunted. I mean, it creaked constantly and weird noises echoed through it all the time. To me, it made sense at first. The knocking grew louder as the weeks passed, to the point where it was hard to ignore. I had two windows in my room, one right above my nightstand and another beside my bed. The knocking always came from the window above the nightstand, the one with bushes right beneath it. The window next to my bed had a large metal box underneath with loud fans that hummed constantly, so nothing ever knocked on that one. I remember one night in particular, it was summer, and I had built a pillow for it in my room. I was cozy, watching YouTube videos on my phone, trying to stay awake as long as I could. Eventually, I got tired, set my phone down, and turned over to sleep. That's when the tapping started. At first, it was soft, like someone testing the glass. I was used to it by then, but it still made my heart race. I lay still, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The tapping turned into knocking, then suddenly pounding. It was so loud I thought the window was going to break. I lay there, frozen, crying silently under my blanket, waiting for it to stop. It felt like an eternity, but eventually the pounding ceased, and everything was still again. After that, the knocking seemed to die down. But other strange things started happening. I noticed that the bushes under my window were oddly shifted, like someone had been hiding there. And then I heard it a phone. It happened twice, once under my sister's window and another time under mine. It was the unmistakable ping of a phone notification, but it was pitch black outside, and no one should have been there. We also started finding random objects outside, things like large rocks, the kind you'd see in a playground, and marbles. Our house didn't have anything like that, and there was no reason for them to be there. I couldn't help but think it was connected to the strange knocking. What really made me suspicious was our neighbor. He was the only one we ever saw, and even that was rare. When we did see him, he'd always be in his yard, staring in our direction. If we caught him looking, he'd quickly move out of sight behind the wooden fence, like he was hiding. There was one day that I'll never forget. It was late afternoon, and my sister and I were sitting on the back porch swing, enjoying the cool air as the sun set. We were facing the white picket fence when I saw him, our neighbor, peering over the fence, watching us. I tried to ignore him, but he started pacing, walking back and forth along the fence, never saying a word, just staring. My sister noticed him too, and we both started feeling uneasy. Our mom must have seen him through the window, because she suddenly called us inside. She stayed by the glass door, watching him as he continued to pace. He never stopped, just kept walking along the fence. Eventually, my mom called our grandfather and my dad to come home. When my grandfather arrived, the neighbor disappeared back into his house. After that incident, the knocking mostly stopped. We still found the occasional rock or marble, but nothing as intense as before. It wasn't until after we moved that I realized just how serious it had been. The family that moved in after us had 2 sons about the same age as my sister and me. Not long after they moved in, they found a letter on their porch. Apparently, the oldest son had accidentally thrown something away and had gone outside to retrieve it from the garbage late one night. The letter read something like, "I saw your son last night digging through the trash. You should tell him to be more careful. You don't know who's watching." They moved out soon after. When I told my parents about this, they were as shocked as I was. The new family had been experiencing the same things. It did knocks at the window, strange objects left outside. But now it was clear that it wasn't just my imagination, and it wasn't a ghost either. Someone had been watching us. Someone was lurking in the shadows, and we had no idea. Even now, thinking back on it, I get chills. We were being stalked by our neighbor, and no one believed me until it was too late. After that night, I thought I'd never touch a Ouija board again, but that didn't mean I stopped thinking about spirits. It wasn't until years later, though, that I made the decision to completely stop communicating with them. There was a very specific reason for it, and it's tied to a person I'll call John. For privacy's sake, I've changed his name. John was someone I grew up with, a friend who was deeply connected to the spirit world. He could sense things the way I had as a child, but he never blocked it out like I did. For him, it was a part of his everyday life. As we got older, we drifted apart, but we stayed in touch on and off. Then, one day, I found out that John had died. The circumstances were strange, and there were whispers that his death had something to do with the spirits he was always in contact with. It shook me to my core, because up until that point, I had convinced myself that spirits couldn't really harm us, that they were just another part of the world we didn't fully understand. John's death made me rethink everything. I couldn't help but wonder if, by staying open to that world, he had invited something in that he couldn't handle. It wasn't long after his passing that I decided to close that door for good. I stopped seeing spirits years ago, but I had never stopped acknowledging them until then. Now, I don't participate in any form of spirit communication. No more Ouija boards. No more trying to sense things beyond the physical world. Losing John felt like a warning, one I wasn't willing to ignore. Maybe the spirits we connect with are just echoes of something else, or maybe there's something much darker. Either way, I've chosen to leave them behind, and I haven't looked back since. I must have been around 5 or 6 when it happened. I was sleeping next to my mom, waiting for my dad to come home from work. He was supposed to get back late that night, sometime between 1 and 2 a.m. It was winter, so the windows were shut tight, no fan was on, and the house was as quiet as could be. I've always been a light sleeper, even as a kid. So when I heard someone come in, I didn't think much of it. It had to be my dad, right? He entered the room and greeted me, asking if I was pretending to be asleep. I remember him saying he had brought my favorite chocolates, and I couldn't help but giggle. I told him, yes, I am, thinking it was just a harmless joke, but that's when things started to get weird. A moment later, my mom came into the room, looking little confused. She asked me if I had heard the doorbell, because apparently someone had rung it, but it wasn't my dad. She thought someone had just ding-dong ditched us in the middle of the night. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too young to piece everything together. But a strange thought crept into my mind as I lay there. If it wasn't my dad, then who asked me if I was asleep? Who promised me chocolates? That's when I started to freak out. I told my mom, but of course, she didn't believe me. She thought I was just being a kid, making up stories in the middle of the night. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the fear started to settle, and I must have drifted off to sleep for a bit. But something woke me up. I felt something touch my face, almost like it was caressing me. I didn't dare open my eyes. I just lay there, frozen in fear, hoping it would go away. Then I heard the sound of a hanger falling from the closet. My eyes shot open, but there was nothing, no one. Just me and my mom, still fast asleep beside me. I tried to calm down, but then the doorbell rang again. My heart raced. I was so scared I literally peed myself. After that, things get a little blurry. I don't remember what happened next, just that overwhelming feeling of fear. Even now, I wonder, was it just my imagination running wild? Who talked to me in the middle of the night, offering me chocolates? And how did that hanger fall when there was no wine, no draft, nothing to move it? To this day, I still don't have any answers. It's been 2 years, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I live out in the countryside of Ireland, right in the middle of nowhere. It's a quiet place. Rarely do I hear noises outside. Most of the time, if I do, it's just a cow that's escaped a field or our dog barking at someone walking by. But what happened that night was something I still can't explain, and I've tried to rationalize it countless times. It was late spring, and the night was clear and dark. I could see every star in the sky as I made my way into the kitchen for a midnight snack. Everything seemed normal until I started hearing a noise outside. At first I thought it was probably some animal, but the sound grew louder and more unsettling. Curious, I opened the window to get a better look or hear it more clearly. The only thing I saw was my dog standing beside the back door, staring intently at the forest behind our house. That in itself was unusual because my dog, a big Newfoundland, was not barking or showing any sign of aggression. Normally, she would have barked at anything unusual, but she was just frozen, staring at the forest. The noise was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a harsh, scraping sound, almost like metal being scraped, but with a croaky edge to it. It was disturbing enough that I decided to bring the dog inside and go to bed. However, the sound seemed to follow me. Even when I was in my room, it felt like the noise was now coming from the front of the house, which made no sense since it had started from the back. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head, but then came a tap on my window. It wasn't just a tap, it was a constant, rhythmic tap, like little stones being thrown at the glass. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the tapping until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I started talking to my neighbors and discovered that a man had moved into the house just around the corner from us. He had a reputation. From what I gathered, he was not a law-abiding citizen, had numerous run-ins with the police, and was rumored to be a major drug dealer. A month later, a massive stash of weed and other drugs was found in a shed down the road, and I never saw that man again. It dawned on me that the noises and the tapping might have been him trying to torment me. He was high, but how could he make that sound for hours straight and then appear at the front of my house so quickly? It just doesn't add up. What still haunts me is the thought of what might have happened if I had gone outside to investigate. What were his intentions? What would he have done if he found me? To this day, I wonder if I narrowly avoided something much worse that night. In my late 20s, my close cousin Joan, her husband, and her young son found themselves in difficult times. They had no choice but to move into her sister Kate's house. The house was already home to Kate, her husband, and a grown man they were taking care of. I was eager to visit and catch up, so when Joan invited me over, I was excited. We spent the evening brewing coffee, ordering pizza, and playing Yahtzee, just like old times. We were having a great time, laughing and being competitive until it started getting late. I decided it was time to head home, but Joan suggested I come with her to the basement to say hello to Kate and her husband, who had just arrived home. The basement stairs had no light, just a burnt-out bulb. Joan started down ahead of me, and I followed slowly, being careful in the dark. That's when I saw him, a man walking up the stairs. It was pitch black, but he was clear as day, wearing a white t-shirt, blue jeans, and no shoes, with dark black hair and blue eyes. He looked like he hadn't shaved, and he walked straight through me. I froze, stunned by the eerie experience. Dawn's voice called out from below, "Where are you?" I shook off the unsettling encounter and made my way down to meet her. We reached a cozy, well-lit living area where Kate and her husband greeted us. They mentioned another exit to the basement, which I could use to leave. I didn't mention what I had seen. I was unsure if I'd just imagined it. Weeks later, Joan called in a panic, asking me to come over immediately. I rushed to her house, arriving around 9 p.m. Joan was alone for the first time since they moved in, and she was hysterical. After calming her down, I learned what had terrified her. While folding laundry and watching TV, she had heard children crying from her closet. When she checked, there was nothing there, but the crying continued, accompanied by a woman's scream and a gunshot. I decided to check the house for myself. Joan led me to her room, where I inspected the closet and the surroundings, but found nothing. We went outside to look around with a flashlight I found on the kitchen counter, but still there was no sign of anything unusual. I stayed with Joan until her husband came home. Sitting with her in the living room, as we chatted, I suddenly heard a faint, sorrowful sobbing that grew into a heart-wrenching cry. I jumped up, opened the closet door, and the sound stopped immediately. Joan was terrified, but I was more bewildered than scared. I held her hand and we stayed in the living room until her husband arrived. The next Monday, I visited my mother at the police department, where I knew several officers. I spoke to a lieutenant who remembered the address. He shared a chilling story. A family of four had lived in the house before. In a fit of rage, the father had killed his wife and children, hiding them in the closet before taking his own life by hanging himself in the backyard. Kate and her husband had continued to live there until the man they were caring for passed away. Joan and her family moved out a month later, unable to handle the haunting presence in their home. I used to live in a neighborhood right across the street from a graveyard. Strange things have always happened throughout my life, even when I lived elsewhere. However, when I moved to this particular neighborhood, the weird events started happening more frequently. At the time, I lived with my stepdad, my mom, my biological sister, and a few step-siblings. I shared a room with my stepbrother, Zone. We were both in the third grade and slept in a bunk bed, me on the top bunk and him on the bottom. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard something that made me freeze in place. The closet door, which was right at the foot of our bed, slowly creaked open, making this eerie, almost vocal sound. I was not sure if Zone was awake, so I whispered, "Zone." When he didn't respond, I tried again, this time a bit louder. "Zone, did you hear that?" Suddenly, I heard him gasp, a sharp, terrified kind of gasp, the kind someone makes when they see something horrifying. I turned to look at the closet, and there they were, the glowing green eyes staring right at me, and then at Zone. Beneath those eyes was a sickly green grin stretching across the face like something out of a nightmare. It looked kind of like the smile of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, but far more menacing. A shiver ran down my spine, and I could feel my eyes welling up with tears. I had no idea why it scared me so much, but it did. Despite how terrified I was, I grabbed my Spider-Man body pillow and threw it at the thing in the closet. Zone had a similar pillow, so I figured maybe it would help. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I was just a kid. I did not know what else to do. My throw caused the door to nearly close, but it didn't quite latch shut. It was still slightly ajar. We sat there in silence for a moment, trying to figure out what just happened. Finally, I asked Zone, "Did you see that?" He replied, "Yeah. One of us needs to go get Mom and Dad." Just as he was finishing his sentence, the closet door started creaking open again, And this time, the sound was even louder and more drawn out than before. We were both paralyzed with fear as the door revealed that same green face, grinning at us with glowing eyes. Zone, in his panic, threw his Spider-Man pillow at it this time, and once again the door almost closed. We watched it closely, not sure what to expect. Then, after what felt like forever, we heard it again. Error. The door started creeping open for a third time. I have no idea what came over me, that I suddenly yelled, "Forget this," and sprinted down the long hallway as fast as I could, straight to my mom's room. I woke her and my stepdad up, screaming about what we had seen. My stepdad got up and went to our room. He turned on the light, opened the closet door, and flipped on the closet light. There was nothing there, nothing at all. My brother and I tried to explain what we saw, but my stepdad didn't believe us. He even pointed out some cheap, glow-in-the-dark vampire teeth in the closet, trying to say that those were what we saw, but Zone and I knew better. Even if those fake teeth explained the face, they couldn't explain why the door kept opening by itself. Things settled down after that, except I started waking up with random nosebleeds for a few mornings in a row. It was strange, but we moved on that summer. I had to attend summer school in a nearby town. I hated it because I didn't know anyone there. We got along pretty well, and I thought we could become friends. For some reason, I decided to tell him about the green face from that night. Maybe the Peter Pan play reminded me of it. I don't know. As I described what happened, the kid's face went pale, and he suddenly looked terrified. He began speaking in Spanish, and with tears in his eyes, he whispered to me, "That is Azazel. He is a demon." Hearing that gave me chills. A part of me felt guilty for leaving Zone alone in that room with whatever that thing was. But I couldn't help it. I needed to get out of there. If I had not run, I do not know what would have happened to us. I have had many more supernatural experiences since then, and I will have to share them someday. Thank you for reading. P.S. There are real things out there that we do not understand. If someone you know says they experienced something strange, be there for them. It is hard to deal with these things alone. This story is a combination of a few events that took place when I was in the 1st through 3rd grades living in New Mexico. I am 13 years old now, and I decided to share my story after reading about others' experiences. Some background. Strange things began happening when I stayed over at my grandparents' house, where I would often spend the night. I will call them GM Grandma and GP Grandpa. One night I stayed up late with GM until about 11 p.m. at the time. I did not really have access to the internet, but I had heard that midnight was the devil's hour. That always stuck with me, and I was scared of being awake around that time. After reading the Bible with GM, she sent me to bed in my mom's old room. GM stayed in the den. While GP had already been asleep for a few hours, I woke up sometime around midnight. I could not be sure of the exact time, but my fear made me think it was the middle of the night. I went to the bathroom, which was close to my room, and as I returned to bed, I got this unsettling feeling that something was behind me. I tried to brush it off and go back to sleep. Maybe 20 to 30 minutes later, I woke up again, and this time I saw it. There was a figure standing in the doorway of my room. It was about the same height as my grandpa, except it was tall around 6', even though the doorway was only about 6'5". The figure had to bend its neck to fit through the door, and the way its head was tilted still haunts me to this day. At first, I thought it was GP. But something was off. The figure had no facial features, just pitch blackness where a face should be. The moment I saw it, it froze, and I did, too. Instead of staring at it for hours like in the movies, I forced myself to go back to sleep. I hoped that ignoring it would make it go away. But I woke up again, maybe 20 to 30 minutes later, and now the figure was in the middle of my room, blocking the entrance. It stood there, unmoving, and I forced myself to sleep again. Despite the growing terror, the last time I woke up, the figure was directly above me, its neck bent at a 90-degree angle, staring down at me with its body hovering over my bed. This time I could make out red, beady eyes glowing in the darkness. Nothing else, just those eyes. I was stuck, unable to move or speak. I could not even force myself to sleep this time until the figure allowed me to. After what felt like an hour, I nodded off, and when I woke up the next morning, I rushed to GM's bed to sleep more until GP came back from his bike ride. A few months later, I stayed over at my grandparents' house again. I tried to suppress the memory of what had happened the last time, not wanting to fear their home, which had always been a comforting place for me. The same routine unfolded. I read the Bible with GM, talked with her, and went to bed around 11 p.m. this time. I woke up an hour later, only to find myself standing in the hallway near the bathroom. I had never sleepwalked before, and as far as I know, I have not done it since. I went back to bed, thinking nothing of it. But then I woke up again, this time farther down the hallway, near the entryway to the house. That place had always made me uncomfortable. It was long, but also strangely short, and it gave me an eerie feeling. Again, I went back to bed, trying not to think too much about it. But I woke up once more, this time to a light knocking sound. That was when I finally started getting scared. I stood up and ran to the den, where GM was sleeping, but for some reason, I did not wake her up. I cannot explain why, but I did not even try. I just ran to GP's room, where I found him snoring. As usual, the knocking grew louder, faster, more intense. Yet somehow neither GM nor GP woke up. I realized then that if they were both asleep, neither of them could have been the one knocking. And that is when I saw them again, those beady red eyes just barely visible through the movements, and I was terrified. I ran back to my room, and as soon as I stepped inside, the knocking stopped. I managed to fall asleep quickly, somehow pushing the fear aside until the morning. But even then, I did not tell GM or GP what had happened. A few years later, I worked up the courage to ask GM if she had ever experienced anything paranormal. This was after I had started using the internet and learning more about such things. To my surprise, she described seeing a large, dark figure, a trickster. She called it something that would hide things from her and mess with her. Her description was eerily similar to what I had seen. I still have not told her about my experiences, and I do not know if I should. If anyone reading this knows what GM and I might be dealing with, or if you live in New Mexico and have experienced something similar, please let me know. This past summer, I went camping in rural Nevada, an area with deep Native American history and roots. My dad's younger sister and I had decided to leave the mountains early and hike down to visit some cousins who live nearby in a tiny, almost forgotten town. You know those places you pass on road trips, with just a gas station and maybe a small grocery store, where you wonder who even lives there? That's the kind of place my cousins had just moved to, a quiet little corner of the world, hidden from outsiders. The town itself wasn't much, but once you took a few dirt roads and turns, you'd find a secluded neighborhood with houses spaced out by big lots of land. Everyone there was connected in some way by blood, marriage, or lifelong friendships. It was a peaceful, rancher lifestyle. My cousins had recently moved into a big, beautiful wooden cabin. We stayed with them for 2 nights, and on the last night something happened that I still think about. We had just finished a late-night game of cards. It was dark out, and most of the house was asleep. The only light on was in the kitchen, and the moths were swarming the window and back door, drawn to the glow. After we cleaned up, I offered to take the deck of cards outside, since my cousins had left their game boxes on the back porch. While they unpacked, I stepped out onto the porch, alone in the quiet night, bending down to rearrange the stack of games. My back was to the trees and brush, and the bugs buzzed around me, circling the dim porch light. That's when I heard a faint whistling. At first I thought it was my dad, because the whistle sounded exactly like the one he uses to call us when it's time to leave. It's this familiar, comforting sound that I've heard my whole life, but it's one of those small things you don't really think about. The whistling came again, repeating 3 to 5 more times. I wasn't scared, just confused. I stood there, still hunched over the box of games, trying to make sense of it. Out of curiosity, I glanced toward the woods just for a moment. That's when I knew it was time to go. It's ironic, really. The whistling that my dad always used to signal it was time to leave was coming from something out there in the dark. Without a word, I walked back inside, closed the door, and went to bed. I didn't mention it to my cousins, not wanting to scare them, and even after leaving, I've hardly spoken about it. But I wonder about it a lot. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew something so personal, my dad's whistle, something only I would recognize. I don't really believe in the supernatural or folklore, but I can't help but think about it. The area is rich with Native American history, and I have a deep respect for their culture and stories, especially those about skinwalkers. I've read a lot about them, and though I'm not superstitious, a part of me wonders. That knowledge helped me that night, helped me resist the urge to call out or interact with the whistling coming from the woods. It's strange, though something that I've only ever heard from my dad, someone I love and know so well, came from something in the darkness that I will never understand. When I was 10, I lived in an apartment in Seoul, South Korea, Unit 304, on the 3rd floor. I'll never forget this one particular nightmare that still haunts me today. It started innocently enough. I was playing jump rope with other kids in front of our apartment on a bright, sunny day. But then, out of nowhere, a strange man in his late 20s approached me and asked where my mom was. Immediately, I felt uneasy. Something deep inside told me not to trust him. So I pointed over the hill and lied, telling him that my mom was over there. As soon as he left in that direction, I had a strange vision of him entering a shaman's house. The shaman began scolding him, yelling something I couldn't fully understand at the time. All I knew was that she was angry he was looking for my mom. That's when everything changed. The bright day turned into complete darkness. The other kids vanished, and I was left standing alone in front of the apartment in the dead of night. Terrified, I tried to head home, but as I approached the entrance, a ghost appeared and slammed the door shut. Somehow, I managed to push my way in. But what awaited me inside was worse than I could have imagined. Ghosts were everywhere, walking, floating around the ground floor like they belonged there. It felt like I'd stepped into another realm. But I swallowed my fear and made my way up the stairs. 1 floor up, level 1. 2 floors up, level 2. But as I climbed again, the sign still read level 2. I thought the ghosts were trying to trick me, and I smirked, proud that I wouldn't fall for it. I confidently walked into what I thought was the third floor, where my apartment was. But when I checked the door numbers, they were all wrong, random numbers I'd never seen before. I counted the doors from left to right, trying to make sense of it. 94,810, 726,530, 395,857, and finally 1201. That had to be it. I opened the door expecting to find my home, but instead I stumbled into a funeral. My mom was there, but they told me she was dead. I woke up from that nightmare in a cold sweat, but it never left my mind. A few months later, my dad announced we were moving. I was excited to leave that apartment behind, but when we got to our new place, my excitement turned to shock. We moved right across from our old apartment and our new unit. It was 1201, the number from my dream. In the 2 years that followed, everything fell apart. My parents' relationship grew, toxic fights, infidelity, and eventually divorce. After the split, my dad moved out, and I left Korea to live in Australia. Every time I visited, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling in that apartment. I avoided the bathroom because I always felt like something was watching me from the gap in the door across the hall. My mom felt it too, like a presence lurking in that room. Eventually, my mom became friends with a shaman who often visited the apartment. One day, the shaman revealed something chilling. A young man in his mid to late 20s was always standing in the corner, watching my mom. She said he had an unhealthy obsession with her, trying to sabotage any relationship she formed with other men. Years later, I shared my nightmare with my sister, and she told me she'd had a similar dream when we were younger. In her dream, our family was being chased by ghosts, and we ran into a house numbered 1201. That strange man in my dream, was he the same ghost the shaman described? Was he calling my mom to that apartment? Now I wonder if the shaman in my dream was an ancestor, scolding him for wanting her. A lot of heartache involving men followed my mom in that house, but that's a story for another time. This memory, though this nightmare was the first time I truly felt the presence of something supernatural, and it won't ever leave me. My birthday is October 21st, and I've always had an obsession with Halloween and anything horror-related. For as long as I can remember, I've celebrated every birthday with a Halloween theme. This story, though, took place almost 11 years ago, when I turned 13, and it's something I've tried to forget, though it still lingers. As usual, I had a sleepover party, and we watched scary movies. That year, the big feature was The Exorcism of Emily Rose. My aunt, who was living with us at the time, kept making odd comments throughout the night. She said things like, "You're asking for trouble with this." But I brushed it off. Nothing too eventful happened. Until about 1 a.m., when we started the movie. At one of the movie's most intense parts, where Emily leaves her dorm room and peers outside, my dog, who had been in another room, started howling. He had never howled before, and never did again after that night. It was eerie, but we kept watching. My aunt, who had been upstairs, came down but didn't say much. As the movie neared its climax, the scene with the demons in the barn, my aunt suddenly jumped up. At the exact moment her feet hit the ground, the power went out in the living room and my bedroom. It wasn't unusual for the power to flicker, especially at night, but this felt different. My aunt calmly flipped the breaker, and everything was fine. We didn't finish the movie, though we switched to SpongeBob and fell asleep. The next morning, 2 of my friends left early without much explanation. The whole house felt heavy. Even though nothing else happened that day, it was as if something dark had settled in. 3 weeks went by without any incidents. Then the nightmares began. In every dream there was a tall woman. Her figure was shadowy, like a 3D silhouette, but I could still make out lines in her features. She wore a simple dress and was always there, watching me. The dreams weren't all the same. Sometimes I'd be running through a forest or falling down a hill, but no matter what, she was always there, staring at me. When I woke up, I'd find scratches on my body, deep, self-inflicted scratches. My mom and I tried everything to stop it. I cut my nails short, taped gloves to my hands, and even slept with my mom in the room. Nothing worked. The scratches kept getting worse, and the school noticed. CPS got involved, and I was sent to therapy. They wanted to know if I was safe at home, and I told them the truth about the dreams. My brother also started having nightmares, though his weren't as specific, just frequent. This went on for 8 months. One day, I woke up to find my mom had packed all of our things. Without warning, she moved us to my grandma's house, and we never went back to that old home. We stayed at my grandma's for a few weeks until we found a new place. Once we moved, the nightmares stopped. The scratches healed within a few weeks, and I haven't had any issues since except for insomnia and anxiety, which started around that time and never really went away. Years later, I learned the real reason my mom moved us so abruptly. She told me that the night we left, she was sitting in the living room after putting us to bed. She was wide awake just 10 minutes after tucking us in, when she saw a tall, shadow-like woman walk down the hallway. The figure stopped at my brother's room, looked inside, and then entered mine. My mom followed, but as she got to my room, she heard a voice say, "You've already lost her." That was when she turned on all the lights and started packing. I haven't celebrated my birthday since that year. I didn't realize it until recently, but I've always avoided it. I still wonder if what we experienced was just anxiety, or if something more sinister had been at play. Whatever it was, I'm still haunted by that memory. This might sound strange, but I've always felt an acute awareness of my own mortality. Even as a kid, I understood that life was temporary, that everything, our cars, homes, clothes, would eventually fade away. When I was 11 or 12, I told my grandma I couldn't see myself living past 16. It wasn't a dark or morbid thought. It just felt like a fact. Whenever I tried to imagine myself in the future, I couldn't. It was like looking into a fog, a fuzzy hole. It seemed that after my teen years, there was nothing, and that felt ... normal. That strange certainty lingered until October 11th, 2010. When I was 15, that evening, I was at the park with my best friend and my new puppy. As the sun set, we decided to head home. I was only a block from my house when everything changed. I was crossing the street when a car hit me at 35 to 45 miles per hour. The driver didn't stop. Witnesses later told me different versions of what happened next. Some said I flew onto the car's windshield and over the top. Others thought I was run over or dragged across the asphalt. All I know is I don't remember any of it. A young woman who had been nearby heard the impact and rushed over. She was studying nursing and considering veterinary school, and fate handed her a situation that required both skills. She checked for signs of life. Nothing. No pulse, no breathing, and my pupils were fully dilated. She checked me 3 times before accepting that I was gone. My puppy was injured too, and the woman comforted her until she passed. About 10 minutes later, the EMTs arrived. I had been dead the entire time, but as the woman was tending to my dog, she suddenly saw me moving. She panicked and sure of what was happening. But she kept me still until help could get me stabilized. At the hospital, the doctors found I had a brain bleed, skull fractures, and a fractured pelvis. They intubated me and prepped me for life flight to a larger hospital with a better-equipped trauma team. It was touch and go, and they weren't sure I'd survive the helicopter ride. I don't remember much except briefly waking up and feeling the tubes in my throat before blacking out again. Somehow, I made it to the bigger hospital when the surgeons prepared to drill into my skull to drain the brain bleed. One of them stopped, saying he thought the bleed had resolved. Sure enough, a CT scan confirmed it had disappeared. The team focused on my fractured pelvis instead, placing 2 6-inch screws across my hips. I spent a few days in a coma before waking up, my first clear memory being of asking my mom why my butt hurt so much. I spent about a week in the hospital, and the doctors were amazed at how quickly I healed. Everything that should have gone wrong didn't. I was back at school within weeks, even though I'd been expected to miss the rest of the year. I declined to participate in a medical study on my recovery, mostly because I was terrified of needles. But in hindsight, I wish I'd said yes. To this day, I'm curious about how my body survived something so catastrophic. Now, over a decade later, I'm left with lasting effects, memory issues, occasional migraines, vertigo, and a tremor in my right hand, but I'm alive. And yet, ever since that night, I've felt like I don't belong. It's as though my story ended when I was 15, and now I'm just existing in the background, taking up space that wasn't meant for me. It's a strange feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. But I am, and I don't know what to do with that. Has anyone else felt like this after a near-death experience? Maybe I'm just overthinking it, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to survive that night. It was well past midnight when I finally arrived at the Elmwood Hotel. The journey had been long, the roads winding through dark, unfamiliar territory. By the time I reached the hotel, I was utterly exhausted, my eyelids heavy, and my body aching from the hours spent behind the wheel. The Elmwood was the only place I could find in this remote area, a grand old building that seemed to have been plucked straight from a different era. Its faded brick facade and dimly lit sign were barely visible in the fog that clung to the night. I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth of the lobby, which contrasted sharply with the chill outside. The place was quiet, eerily so. The front desk was manned by a single clerk, an elderly man with thinning hair and a weary expression. He looked up as I approached, offering a tired but polite smile. "Welcome to the Elmwood Hotel," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "How can I help you?" "I'd like a room for the night," I replied, my voice sounding just as tired as I felt. The clerk nodded and reached for a large, dusty register on the desk. He flipped through the pages, his fingers moving slowly, almost methodically. After a moment, he looked up at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not many guests this time of year," he remarked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "But we do have a room available, room 714. He handed me an old-fashioned key, the kind with an ornate metal tag attached. The number 714 was engraved on it, worn but still legible. "Your room is on the 7th floor, the clerk said, pointing toward the elevator at the far end of the lobby. "Enjoy your stay," I thanked him and made my way to the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. As I rode up to the 7th floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hotel had a strange, musty smell, and the decor was outdated. Faded wallpaper, dim lighting, and threadbare carpeting that seemed to belong to a different time. The elevator doors open with a soft chime, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched out before me. The walls were lined with old paintings, their colors muted and their frames tarnished with age. The carpet underfoot was thick, but the pattern was faded and worn in places. I glanced at the numbers on the doors as I walked, each one labeled with a brass plate: 710, 711, 712, but there was no sign of room 714. The hallway seemed to go on forever, the lights growing dimmer the further I walked. Just as I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake, I spotted it, a door at the very end of the hallway, almost hidden in the shadows. The brass plate on the door read 714, though the numbers were slightly askew, as if the plate had been hastily attached. I hesitated for a moment, a strange feeling of unease settling over me, but I was too tired to care. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some rest. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it, the mechanism clicking softly as the door swung open. The first thing that struck me about room 714 was how old-fashioned it was. The furnishings were all impeccably clean, but they looked like they hadn't been updated in decades. The bed was a massive four-poster with heavy drapes that hung down on all sides. The wallpaper was a deep burgundy with an intricate floral pattern, and the carpet was a rich, dark green. A large wooden wardrobe stood against one wall, and an ornate vanity with a round mirror occupied the opposite corner. The room was illuminated by a single, dim lamp on the knitstand, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a television, but it was one of those old boxy models from the 1980s, sitting on a wooden stand near the foot of the bed. The air was cool, almost cold, and there was a faint smell of mothballs and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Despite its age, the room was spotless. The bed was neatly made, the linens crisp and white. The wooden furniture gleamed in the soft light, free of dust or grime. It was as if the room had been preserved in time, untouched by the years that had passed outside its walls. I set my bag down on the bed and let out a deep sigh of relief. My exhaustion had overtaken any feelings of unease I might have had, and all I could think about was getting some sleep. I quickly changed into my pajamas and climbed into bed, the mattress firm but surprisingly comfortable. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the room. It was too quiet, too still, as if the air itself was holding its breath. But fatigue won out, and before I knew it, I had drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I was jolted awake by the sound of a phone ringing. The noise was sharp and piercing, echoing through the silence of the room. I sat up, disoriented, and looked around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was an old rotary phone, sitting on the knitstand next to the bed. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in with the rest of the room's outdated decor. The phone continued to ring, insistent and demanding. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something compelled me to pick it up. I lifted the receiver to my ear, expecting to hear a voice on the other end. But there was nothing, just silence. I waited for a moment, my heart pounding, but still no one spoke. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the crackling static. "Please, help me." The voice was distant, distorted, as if it were coming from a great distance. I felt a chill run down my spine as I strained to hear more, but the line went dead. I quickly hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer and darker. I glanced at the clock on the knitstand. It was just after 3 a.m. The unease I had felt earlier had returned, stronger than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the room, that something was watching me from the darkness. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a prank call, a glitch in the phone system. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the image of the voice on the other end, pleading for help. The television flickered on by itself, the screen filled with static. I bolted upright, staring at the old boxy TV in disbelief. The remote was on the knit stand untouched. I grabbed it and tried to turn off the TV, but the screen remained lit, the static hissing softly, and then, through the static, I saw something, a figure, faint and shadowy, standing in the center of the screen. The image flickered and jumped, but the figure remained unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, but it was clear that the figure was a person watching me through the screen. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The figure began to move slowly at first, and then more quickly, as if approaching the camera. I fumbled with the remote, my hands shaking, and finally managed to turn the TV off. The room was plunged into darkness, the silence deafening. I sat there in the dark, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of glitch, a trick of the light? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong with this room, something deeply, terribly wrong. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep after that. My nerves were shot, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I needed to know more about this room, about what was happening here. I got out of bed and began to search the room, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the strange occurrences. I checked the wardrobe first, half expecting to find something hidden inside, but it was empty, save for a few wooden hangers that clattered together as I opened the door. The vanity was equally bare, its drawers containing nothing but dust. Finally, I turned my attention to the bed. I lifted the mattress, expecting to find nothing, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw it, a small, leather-bound book, wedged between the mattress and the box spring. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink slightly faded with age. The first entry was dated nearly 50 years ago, July 3rd, 1972. I've checked into room 714 at the Elmwood Hotel. The journey was long, and I'm exhausted, but there's something about this room that doesn't feel right. The air is heavy, and the shadows seem to move on their own. I can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the entry. It mirrored my own experience so closely that it was uncanny. I flipped through the pages, skimming the entries, and found that they all told a similar story. Guests who had stayed in room 714, all reporting strange occurrences, all feeling a sense of unease that grew stronger with each passing day. As I continued reading, I noticed that the entries grew darker, more frantic. The guests began to report seeing figures in the mirrors, hearing voices in the walls, and feeling as if something was trying to break into their minds. The final entry was written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. August 12th, 1983. I can't take it anymore. The voices won't stop. The shadows won't leave me alone. I can feel it watching me, waiting. I don't think I'm going to make it out of this room alive. The entry ended abruptly, with a smear of ink that looked almost like blood. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. One had to get out of this room. Now I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, not caring about the noise I was making. But when I reached the door, I found that it wouldn't open. The lock was stuck, the key jammed in place. I tugged on the handle, panic rising in my throat, but it wouldn't budge. The phone rang again, louder this time, more insistent. I turned to look at it. dread pooling in my stomach. The ringing echoed through the room, and with it came the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, close to close. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, but there was none. I was trapped. And then I saw it, the figure from the television, standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The phone stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. I backed up against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. It moved closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, empty, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and bony, and I felt a cold, clammy grip on my wrist. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the bed, the covers neatly tucked around me. The room was quiet, the air still and heavy. The television was off, the phone silent. For a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But then I saw the book, sitting on the knit-stand, its leather cover cracked and worn. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and ran for the door, not even bothering to look back. This time the door opened easily, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The lobby was empty. When I reached it, the front desk abandoned. I didn't wait around to ask questions. I left the key on the counter and bolted for the exit. As I drove away from the Elmwood Hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't know what had happened in room 714, and I didn't want to know. But one thing was certain, I would never set foot in that hotel again. I had heard about the place long before I ever set foot there. It was one of those stories that floated around the fringes of journalism, whispered over drinks by veteran reporters who had heard about it but never dared to go. An apartment complex where tenants vanished without a trace, where strange events drove people mad, leaving only hushed rumors in their wake. No one knew how many had disappeared from there, but the number was enough to earn it a reputation that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I was a reporter, after all, and if there was a mystery begging to be unraveled, I was going to be the one to do it. The complex itself was in an unassuming part of town, tucked away behind rows of aging, forgotten buildings. It looked ordinary from the outside, just another old apartment complex, weathered by time and neglect. But the stories surrounding it were anything but ordinary. I arrived late in the evening, my camera and notebook in hand. The sky was overcast, and a faint drizzle fell, giving the place an eerie, abandoned look. The street was empty, not a soul in sight. Even the air felt thick, as though the weight of something unseen pressed down on everything around me. As I approached the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The windows of the complex were dark, but I felt eyes on me, following my every move. I ignored the sensation and pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the atmosphere was oppressive. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering lights casting long shadows on the walls. The air smelled musty, like something old and forgotten. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The first apartment I passed had a faded number on the door, 203. I knocked, but there was no answer. I tried the knob. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but the apartment was empty. It was furnished as though someone had lived there, but there were no signs of life, no dishes in the sink, no clothes left behind, just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I took a few photos and jotted down some notes before moving on to the next apartment. Each one I entered was the same, furnished but empty. It was as if the tenants had vanished into thin air, leaving everything behind. Then I reached the 4th floor. Something was different here. The air was colder, and there was a faint humming sound coming from somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. I walked down the hallway, my heart beating faster with each step. There was an apartment at the end of the hall, with its door slightly ajar. The number had been scratched off, leaving only deep gouges in the wood. I hesitated before pushing the door open. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. As I stepped inside, the humming grew louder. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, casting a beam of light across the room. My breath caught in my throat. The walls were covered in writing, scribbled words, drawings, symbols I couldn't understand. They were everywhere, scrawled in what looked like charcoal or maybe something darker. My hands shook as I snapped a few photos, trying to capture the madness on the walls. Whoever had lived here had lost their mind, that much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the room, but there was nothing there, just an empty room and the strange markings on the walls. But I knew I had seen something or someone. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I ran to the door and yanked it open, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled into the hallway, breathing hard, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The hallway was empty, but the humming sound was still there, following me. I didn't want to spend another second in that place. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty complex. I burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The rain had picked up, soaking my clothes. As I sprinted to my car, I drove away from that apartment complex as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The humming sound lingered in my ears for hours after I got home, and the images of those scribbled walls haunted my dreams for weeks. I never went back to that place, and I never wrote the stories. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Hi everyone, I'm not sure if this is the right place for this story, but I feel like I have to share it. Posting it here seems like my only option anywhere else. People would probably think I'm crazy. It all started when my new neighbor moved in a couple of months ago. I didn't pay much attention to him at first, but the few times I've seen him, he gave me the creeps. The first time we met was the day he moved in. He looked normal enough, maybe a little sweaty and disheveled, but there was something off about him. As I walked over to greet him, he gave me this strange look. "Hi, welcome to the neighborhood. Nice to meet you, and I hope we'll see more of you around," I said, trying to be friendly. He turned, a smile spreading unnaturally wide across his face. "Have you heard of him?" he asked. I blinked, confused. Of who? He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language, then bowed his head as if in prayer, whispering reverently, "Him, he who speaks the gruesome words in prayer, who gives dire sermons in the abhorrent. He shows us the way in the revolting and paints the horrific in unholy murals." As he spoke, his eyes gleamed with a strange light, his body trembling with growing intensity. Before I could back away, he grabbed my shoulders, pulling me close, his breath hot against my ear as he rasped, "He will guide us, and you'll know him soon." With that, he released me and shuffled back into his house, laughing softly under his breath. From that day forward, Every night I heard him through the walls. He would mutter strange words, laughing and sometimes screaming. It was as if someone else was in the house with him, but I never saw anyone enter or leave. I couldn't understand the words, but there was always a deep voice, almost like a growl echoing beneath his ramblings. Out of curiosity, I tried searching online for any clue about what he'd said, but there was nothing but a report by someone named Detective W. was obscure, buried deep in an old forum. But one passage stood out to me. W. had interviewed a woman who had been obsessed with him, the same phrase my neighbor used. He who shows the way in the revolting. The report described how she'd locked herself in her room, stamping the floor, screaming that he would save her. She had drawn strange sigils on the walls with her own blood, spiraling into madness until, by the time they broke the door down, she was too far gone. The description of what they found was beyond words, an abominable sight. It unnerved me. My neighbor was following the same path, wasn't he? For weeks, I couldn't help myself. I spied on him. Through my window, I'd watch for any sign of him leaving his house. But he rarely came outside, only venturing out to pick up food deliveries. His once normal behavior had devolved into something darker. He seemed afraid to even step outside. Then, one night, something changed. He didn't appear at the door to collect his usual takeout. Instead, he flung the door open, but didn't step out. The door remained ajar, swaying gently in the night breeze. I waited for him to emerge, but he didn't. Curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't stop myself. I crept to his house, glancing around nervously before stepping inside. The stench hit me immediately, a mixture of rotting food and something far worse, something foul and organic. The place was a disaster. Food was piled on every surface, dishes broken, and the floors were stained with dark smudges I didn't want to identify. It looked as though the house had been abandoned for years. Then I heard a faint sob coming from upstairs. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The hallway was dimly lit, but at the end of it, a red glow seeped from beneath a door. My heart pounded as I approached. Through the crack, I could see my neighbor kneeling in front of a laptop, its screen flickering with static. A low, distorted voice crackled from the speakers, deep and guttural, impossible to decipher. My neighbor sobbed in time with the voice, his body trembling, and then, with a shaking hand, he reached behind him and sawed off one of his own fingers. I stifled a gasp, my hands trembling as I watched in horror. Blood dripped onto the floor, and with a strange, desperate fervor, he smeared the blood into a symbol, a jagged sigil that resembled an H. His body began to convulse violently. His limbs twisted, his skin rippling as though something was moving beneath it. He wailed, the sound unnatural and guttural. Then, with a final, agonized scream, he collapsed. The room went deathly silent. Suddenly, his body jerked upright. His mouth opened wide, far wider than should have been possible, and a thick, red liquid began to pour from his eyes, nose, and mouth. Then a voice, booming and inhuman, echoed from within him. He's here. He will accept you into his dire light once you give yourself as a vessel for him. For he shows the way in the revolting and paints the horrific and unholy murals. Before I could react, his body twisted and snapped, his bones contorting as he turned to face me. His eyes milky and clouded locked onto mine. He rushed toward me, moving on all fours like some deranged animal. His fingers, or what was left of them, dug into my ankle as I tried to run, dragging me back into the room. He was on top of me in an instant, his face inches from mine. The sigil he had drawn on the floor now glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across his face. His breath came in ragged gasps as he traced the same symbol onto my forehead with his blooded hand. "He'll be with you soon," he whispered. Before collapsing in a heap, I ran out of there as fast as I could, not bothering to close the door behind me. That was weeks ago, and I haven't been the same since. Every night I have the same dream, if it even is a dream. There's a face too large and too pale, with black, bottomless eyes and a smile that stretches unnaturally wide, the skin tearing at the edges. I wake up drenched in sweat, and even when I'm awake I can feel something watching me. It's always there. When the house is quiet, I hear faint footsteps creeping up the stairs. I check, but there's never anyone there. The footsteps stop for a few hours, but then they start again. I keep telling myself it's just the sleep deprivation, but deep down I know he's here for me. The rain had been falling for hours, relentless and cold, a constant drumming against the windows of my isolated farmhouse. I had grown accustomed to the sound, the way it seemed to consume the silence, wrapping the house in a cocoon of watery whispers. I was curled up on the couch, nursing a glass of wine and losing myself in a book when it happened to tap, tap, tap. The knock echoed unnaturally through the empty room, making me flinch so hard that a drop of red wine spilled from my glass, staining the couch like a drop of fresh blood. I stared at the dark stain, my mind scrambling to understand what had interrupted the calm. It was late, far too late for visitors, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. Tap, tap, tap. I swallowed hard, setting the glass down and rising slowly to my feet. The knock wasn't frantic, nor did it seem urgent, but something about its rhythm unsettled me. The steady beat of it felt off, as though whoever was on the other side knew I would answer. I moved towards the door, every instinct urging me to ignore it, but curiosity, as it always does, won out in the end. I peered through the small window beside the door, squinting against the rain. 3 figures stood huddled together on the porch, drenched and shivering. The smaller one, a boy, stood with his head hung low, shoulders stiff, as though weighed down by something unseen, his gaze locked on the ground. I hesitated for a moment, but reason told me it was just a family caught in the storm. No need to be paranoid. Taking a breath, I opened the door. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic. The father's rain-soaked coat hung from his frame like a forgotten shadow, his lips stretching into a crooked smile that felt to forced more a grimace than a greeting. Behind him, the mother's eyes darted around nervously, though her face held no real expression. The little boy hadn't moved, his posture unnervingly stiff, his face still hidden beneath his drenched hair. "We had some car trouble down the road," the father's voice rasped, as though the words themselves were a struggle. "Mind if we come in to use the phone?" I hesitated. Everything about them set my nerves on edge, from the strange way they stood to the empty coldness in the man's eyes. But the storm was fierce, and the boy, he was just a child. I couldn't leave them out in this, of course. I stepped aside, gesturing them in. The faster they were inside, the faster they could make their call and leave. But they didn't move right away. Instead, they stood there for a moment longer, staring at me as if trying to make a decision. Then, all at once, they shuffled inside in a disjointed, almost mechanical way, their bodies jerking with unnatural stiffness. It was as though they had forgotten how human limbs were supposed to move. I closed the door, and when I turned back, they were gone. For a moment, my mind struggled to make sense of it. They had just walked in, hadn't they? I stepped forward, confused, and noticed the wet footprints they had left behind, tracking down the hall in 3 different directions. The father's prints led towards the kitchen, the mother's towards the living room, and the boy's. Up the stairs, a chill crawled down my spine as I stared at the muddy tracks. Something wasn't right. Why would they split up like that without a word? I followed the father's tracks first, heading for the kitchen. The lights flickered as I entered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The room was empty. A floorboard groaned above me, the sound dragging on far too long, as if something heavy was shifting ever so slowly. My heart leapt into my throat. The boy, he had gone upstairs, but the house was supposed to be empty. Just me. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and walls as if trying to force its way inside. Then, without warning, the room was swallowed by darkness. The sudden absence of light felt less like a power outage and more like the house itself had blinked. Cutting me off from the world, I lunged for the phone, clinging to it as if it were a lifeline. The cold plastic felt dead in my hand, the weight of silence pressing against my ears before a faint hum broke through, almost like breathing. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling, and when the line connected, I almost sobbed in relief. Double quotes, "Hello. What is your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. But before I could respond, a strange hollow clicking interrupted the line. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it, the sound I dreaded. The familiar moaning that grew louder with each second, reverberating through the phone like something crawling up from the depths of the earth. I dropped the receiver and ran. I fled down the hall, heart pounding in my chest, the candle I had grabbed barely lighting the way. I was so focused on reaching the front door that I didn't notice the boy standing in my path until I nearly collided with him. He was still, his head bowed, his small frame casting an unnatural shadow in the flickering candlelight. Slowly, he lifted his head, revealing dark, hollow sockets where his eyes should have been, and a mouth stretched open in a wide, silent scream. I staggered back, terror gripping me as his limbs jerked into motion, stiff and puppet-like. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I hurled myself into the bedroom at the top. I slammed the door behind me, twisting the lock with shaking hands, but then came the sound I dreaded most. Tap, 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 a slow, deliberate knock on the door, and then another, this time louder, like a fist pounding against the wood. The lights flickered once more, and I heard a moan, long, low, and inhuman, from somewhere inside the house. I backed away from the door, clutching the candle as though it could protect me, but it was too late. I knew, deep in my bones, that the hollow-eyed boy wasn't alone. Outside, the wind howled again. They say seeing is believing, but if I had followed that advice, I might not be here to tell you this story. It all started with my deaf-blind friend, Will, telling me someone else was in the house with us. I did not believe him. I laughed it off. Looking around the empty living room, I checked upstairs in the den, the spare bedroom, and even the kitchen. It was just the two of us. Will sat at the base of the stairs, running his fingers along the banister, while I went upstairs to grab something. When we sat down for tea later, he told me through sign language that he felt another set of footsteps following me up the stairs. He asked who else was in the house. I laughed again, playfully tapping his leg, telling him he must have imagined it. But he was serious. He said he could smell the person. When I asked him to describe it, he told me it was a bad smell, like garbage or someone who needed a bath. I dismissed it, suggesting my trash needed to be taken out. I reassured him it was just us. "Are you sure?" he asked. We were supposed to be working on a script for a game, but he kept interrupting, saying, "There. Do you smell it?" I did not smell anything, and there was no one else in the room. Will got frustrated, signing, "Does your nose even work?" After I dropped Will off at his apartment, he warned me again. He used his hands to show me the feel of two sets of footsteps. One set heavier, like mine, and the other lighter, but still noticeable. He told me to be careful before tapping his way into his building with his white cane. When I got home, I searched the entire house. There were not many places to hide in my small, two-story home. The rent was cheap, but I thought that was because the place was old, with creaky pipes and no air conditioning. I checked the closets, cupboards, and even under the sink. I bought a camera and set it up, but all it captured that night was me sleepwalking. I vaguely remembered waking up on the stairs before going back to bed. According to the footage, I was alone in the house. Still, Will's words stuck with me. People say that if you lose one sense, the others become sharper. What if the opposite was true? Was I relying too much on my eyes and ignoring my other senses? On a whim, I decided to try something. That evening, I walked around the house blindfolded. As I was feeling my way through the kitchen and filling a glass of water, I suddenly felt like I was not alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I was sure someone was right behind me. I yanked off the blindfold. There was no one there. The feeling lingered, though. After a moment, I put the blindfold back on and continued moving around. That is when I noticed a faint smell, like rotten meat or dirty skin. It was subtle, just drifting in and out. I followed the smell upstairs, but lost it when I reached the den. I went back downstairs, lightly trailing my fingers along the wall. Thud, thud, thud. I froze. I felt footsteps behind me, softly echoing mine on the wooden stairs. It was exactly like Will had described. Someone was there. I felt cold breath on my ear. I ripped off the blindfold and spun around. The staircase was empty. That night I had trouble falling asleep, afraid of what might happen. Sure enough, I woke up on the stairs again, sleepwalking. But instead of going back to bed, I tried to stay in that in-between state, keeping my eyes shut. That was when I realized someone was holding my hand, cold. Dead fingers guided me up the stairs. Everything in me screamed to pull away and run, but I let that icy hand lead me. The smell of decay was so strong it made my eyes water as I reached the top. The door to the spare bedroom opened, and the hand led me across the room. I felt my fingers touch the cold handle of the balcony door. It opened, letting in a gust of fresh air. That was when I broke free. I yanked my hand back, flipped on the light, and rushed out of the room. I was alone again. Now I am looking for a new place to live. Will was right. I am not alone in that house, and I know my life is in danger. But finding a new home is tough, and my budget is tight. Until I can move, I have installed a bolt on the balcony doors and pushed a heavy bookcase in front of them. I have locked the spare bedroom. You see, I did some research. The tenant who lived here before me died by hanging himself from that very balcony. Before him, an old woman lived here with her daughter. The daughter was also found hanging. I do not know how many others have died here. The house is not known to be haunted because no one has ever seen a ghost. But I feel someone here every day, following my footsteps, and every night those dead fingers try to lead me out to the balcony. We had all heard the rumors about that quiet stretch of road between towns. They said that if you drove on it at night, the man would appear in your rearview mirror. This was not my first experience with ghosts. I remember the picture my mom took of me when I was 8, where there was a face in the window behind me. Then there was the time when I was 16, and my friends were playing with a Ouija board. Weird stuff started happening, like the planchette suddenly pointing directly at me. One night, my brother asked, if I would come with him to drive down that desolate road. I knew he did not want to go alone. He knew that I was not afraid of ghosts. So I grabbed my lucky silver pendant, and we set off. We sang along to the real Slim Shady as we drove. Like any other ghost story, the instructions were to turn off the headlights and drive in the dark with no one else around, so we did. We drove real slow down that desolate road, and nothing. We had worked ourselves up for nothing and went home disappointed. That was about 10 years ago. A few months later, I got a job that required me to drive that same road every single night. One night, just like any other, I put on my uniform, got in the car, and started driving. I was listening to a podcast about ghost stories. They were telling one about a headless man with an axe who haunted a road in my town. They called him Charles. The story explained that he had been a man in the 1800s who was decapitated by his wife after she caught him cheating. Supposedly, if you drive down the road and say his name in the dark, he will appear in your back seat. I was about to turn off the podcast when I saw something in my rearview mirror, a person. At first, I kept driving, afraid to look, but curiosity got the better of me. When I glanced in the mirror again, there he was. He was staring right at me, holding his severed head between the seats. His bloody axe was laying next to him on the back seat of my Chevy. The air suddenly filled with the smell of musk and iron. "Charles," I whispered. Then a voice came from him hoarse, like he had not had a drink of water in days. It sounded like gravel scraping together. "Victor," he rasped. He said my name. He released his grip on the side of his face and held his head by the hair. Slowly, he grabbed the axe. I do not know what happened after that. I woke up on the side of the road, a paramedic kneeling beside me. They told me I had swerved off the road and hit a tree. They said I was lucky to be alive. At the hospital, I was told I only had minor injuries, scrapes, and bruises. But there was one injury they could not explain, a distinct cut on my right shoulder. It looked like it came from a blade, specifically a wood-cutting axe. They stitched me up, but the nightmares lasted for weeks. I stopped driving down that road. Still, sometimes, no matter where I am, I get the feeling that if I look quickly enough, I might catch a glimpse of him in the back seat, holding my severed head. A while ago, my nephew asked me if I wanted to drive down that desolate road again. "Uncle Vic, you are not afraid of ghosts, right?" "Yes, I am." "Kid, I am afraid of that one." I never believed in the supernatural. As a nurse, science and empirical data were my guides. For 5 years, I handled tough situations, but nothing prepared me for what happened at St. Agnes Hospital 3 months ago. St. Agnes was an old relic, nestled in a forgotten part of the city where time seemed frozen. I didn't have many job options at the time, so when they offered me the night shift, I took it. The pay was decent, and the work seemed straightforward. I expected nothing more than a few quiet nights, but from the moment I stepped into that hospital, something felt off. The building was ancient, originally built as a sanatorium for patients with a rare condition called Eagle syndrome. It's a little-known disease that requires patients to live with minimal exposure to light. That explained the hospital's oppressive atmosphere. The hallways were long and dark, and the flickering lights made it worse. The wood-paneled walls showed their age, and the portraits of the hospital's founders seemed straight out of a horror movie. Their eyes appeared to follow me wherever I went. The silence, broken only by the hum of medical equipment, made the place feel alive, like the building was breathing with its inhabitants. On my first night, I couldn't shake a deep feeling of unease. Something lingered in the corridors, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I dismissed it as my imagination and tried to focus on organizing supplies. But one thing caught my attention immediately. The hospital had no mirrors, none, not in the bathrooms, not in the corridors, not even at the nurses' stations. It was strange, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I brushed it off. Another nurse told me it was to avoid scaring the patients who didn't like mirrors much due to their condition. That explanation made sense, so I let it go. But that sense of unease never left me. A week later, I was assigned to a specific patient. His appearance was horrifying pale, with sunken eyes and skin clinging to his bones. He had no identification and was in a constant state of delirium, murmuring incomprehensible things that made me deeply uncomfortable. While I checked his vitals, he suddenly grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone in his condition. His wild eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought he was trying to tell me something important. But all that came out were mumbled sounds, repeated phrases like ood or ad. Before I could react, he lunged at me and bit my arm with a ferocity that set pain shooting through my body. I instinctively shoved him away, sending him sprawling onto the bed. My arm was bleeding, and I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. The on-call doctor arrived soon after, drawn by the noise, but he was disturbingly calm about it. He looked at the patient with mild annoyance and simply said, "He's delirious. Calm him down with a sedative." I wanted to protest, to explain that something felt off about this entire situation, but the doctor's indifferent expression made me hold back. I sedated the patient as instructed and left the room, shaken but determined to finish my shift. That night I couldn't sleep. The bite on my arm throbbed, and my mind kept returning to that patient's haunting gaze. Something was seriously wrong, but I pushed it to the back of my mind and returned to work the next night. 3 days later, the hospital felt even more oppressive. The air was thick, like it was charged with static. The hallways were darker than usual, the lights flickering more frequently, and that ever-present feeling of being watched grew stronger, like something was lurking just out of sight, following me through every corridor. I decided to check on the patient who had bitten me. When I entered his room, he lay motionless on the bed, pale as death. His lips were stained a dark, ominous red. The monitor showed weak but steady vital signs, but that wasn't what disturbed me. It was the reflection on the steel tray I was holding, or rather the lack of it. I stared at the tray, moving it to different angles. The bed and the equipment reflected perfectly, but the patient's reflection was missing. My blood ran cold. My brain struggled to rationalize what I was seeing, but deep down I knew this was no optical illusion. Before I could react, a cold hand touched my shoulder, and I nearly screamed. It was a veteran nurse, her face expressionless. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I hesitated before nodding. I couldn't explain what I had just witnessed. I left the room, my heart racing, and spent the rest of my shift trying to suppress the growing sense of dread. Later that night I heard voices coming from a dimly lit room. I crept closer and saw a group of doctors and nurses speaking in hushed tones. They had their backs to me, so I stayed hidden and listened. The words they spoke chilled me to my core. They were talking about me. They said he had chosen me as the next victim, and that I was being prepared. One of the doctors mentioned that the patient who bit me was an indicator, a test to see if I was ready for the process. My blood turned to ice. They were planning something sinister, and I was at the center of it. Before I could slip away, I felt a cold presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The patient, the one with no reflection. His raspy breath filled the air, and he whispered my name like a lover's secret. Terror gripped me, and I ran. The hospital seemed to stretch and warp as I fled, the hallways growing longer, the lights dimming further. Doors that had been opened slammed shut in front of me, like the building itself was trapping me. I finally found refuge in a supply room, barricading the door behind me. Outside, I heard the scratching of nails against the wood and the patient's voice, soft and malevolent. "I know you're in there, sweetheart," he whispered. "You don't have to be afraid. It'll all be over soon." Desperation flooded me. I had to escape before it was too late. In a last-ditch effort, I threw open the door and knocked over a shelf full of glass jars. The loud crash startled him, and I used the moment to bolt through the back exit. I didn't stop running until I reached home. The next day, I quit over the phone. No explanation, just that I couldn't work there anymore. They didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for it. Weeks passed, but I couldn't shake what had happened. And then I started noticing changes in myself. My skin was growing paler, and the light hurt my eyes. Yesterday, I fainted after only a few minutes in the sun, and the doctors diagnosed me with Eagle syndrome. They recommended I return to St. Agnes for treatment. I refused. I know what's waiting for me there. So, if you ever find yourself working in a hospital without mirrors, run. It had been raining all day, with the forecast calling for a light shower. Instead, it was torrential. I peeked out the window, watching as rainwater cascaded down the street in small rivers. It was getting late, and my parents were getting worried about my sister, Emily. She had been out at a friend's house and was supposed to be home an hour ago. Just as my dad was about to head out to search for her, the front door opened. Emily walked in, soaked to the bone in her yellow raincoat, holding the collar of an old, wet dog. The dog was a scruffy-looking mutt, but I could make out some Alsatian and maybe some golden retriever in it. As I tried to figure it out, I thought I should put dog breeder on my career list for school. My parents exchanged worried glances. Emily smiled awkwardly and explained how she found the dog shivering in the rain by the side of the road. "There's something about his eyes," she said, "that made me feel sorry for him." My dad knelt down to check the dog's collar, which was faded and battered. No name, phone number, or address. Dad sighed, stood up, and told Emily he would take the dog to the vet on Thursday to check for a microchip. Until then, Emily was responsible for the dog. Emily beamed at the chance and led the dog into the kitchen to dry him off. Later, she came back into the living room and introduced him as Buster. My dad warned her not to get too attached, but Emily was already head over heels for the dog, snapping pictures and sending them to her friends. That night, Buster slept on a bed of old blankets and cardboard in the kitchen. My parents hoped he wouldn't make a mess, but Emily hugged him tightly before rushing off to bed. The next morning, everything seemed fine. Buster hadn't moved much at all. He barely acknowledged us when we came into the kitchen. Emily knelt beside him, rubbing his tummy and playing with his fur. It was almost like she was afraid to take him outside, worried she might run into his real owners. The garden was too muddy from the rain, and Mom wouldn't have let Buster back in if he had muddy paws, so the dog stayed inside with the rest of us. That night, Dad even cooked Buster a lamb chop. It was the most excited I'd seen him. His eyes lit up as he tore into the food, and we all laughed. In the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. The clock on my nightstand glowed for 37 a.m. I lay there, drifting back to sleep, but I could have sworn I heard something moving in the hallway. I figure it was Dad heading to the bathroom and fell asleep again. The next day, I spent most of my time out with friends. When I got home, the house felt different, almost tense. Before I could sneak off to my room, Mom told me what had happened. Emily accidentally knocked over my grandfather's urn while playing with Buster. I stifled a laugh, knowing Emily was probably in huge trouble. Dinner that night was quiet, except for Buster's occasional whining. That night I woke up again, my throat dry. I quietly headed downstairs for water, careful not to disturb Buster. After drinking, I had an idea. I tiptoed to the cabinet and grabbed one of Dad's whiskey bottles. I unscrewed the cap, took a sip, and coughed violently. Just as I went for another, I heard footsteps upstairs. Panicking, I quickly put everything back and hid in the living room, listening as Dad passed through the kitchen. Once he was gone, I snuck back upstairs. I thought I was in the clear, but just as I reached my room, Dad called out. I told him I had gone downstairs for water. He told me to keep it down and went back to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a slight headache. I was home alone. Emily was at dance practice. Mom was out running errands, and Dad was golfing. It was rare to have the house to myself. I found a note from Emily instructing me to feed and look after Buster. I crumpled it up, made myself an unhealthy breakfast, and spent the day watching horror movies. Later, I took my empty plate into the kitchen. Buster was lying in his usual spot, looking completely still. I jokingly asked him how his day was, expecting no response. But when I reached down to give him some ham, there was no reaction, no wagging tail, no blinking, nothing. I touched his stomach, and, to my horror, it felt hollow like a deflated balloon. Panicked, I stumbled back, knocking over a glass. It shattered, but Buster didn't move. I ran upstairs and called my mom, explaining in a shaky voice that something was wrong with the dog. She assured me they'd be home soon. I paced around, waiting, until I heard footsteps from the first floor. I assumed it was my mom, but the door was still locked. I heard the familiar wag of Buster's tail as he approached me, now seemingly fine. I was puzzled, but before I could think, my mom and Emily walked in. Emily, with red eyes from crying, hugged Buster, and everything seemed normal again. That night I woke up once more. Too afraid to move, I kept my eyes shut, but after a while I opened them. Buster was sitting in the doorway, staring at me. I laughed, realizing I had been scared over nothing, and led him back downstairs. As I turned to leave, something caught my figure standing at the fence outside. It was Emily. Before I could call out, I heard a noise from behind me. I turned and saw Buster's stomach began to split open. Long, crimson fingers reached out, pulling something monstrous out from inside him. The creature stood grotesque and towering, filling the room. Terrified, I ran upstairs, screaming. My father grabbed a baseball bat, and the next few hours were a blur of fear and confusion as my family tried to piece together what had just happened. That night marked the beginning of the end of our peace. Something had come into our home, and it wasn't leaving without a fight. Let me make this clear from the start. No, I don't believe my family's house was haunted back then. But whatever the reason, something sinister came for me during the summer of 2006. It all began on a night when my 9-year-old self was more interested in playing a handheld game with the volume turned low than sleeping. Around 2 a.m, my ordeal began out of nowhere. I heard the door slowly creak open. Immediately, I shoved the console under my pillow to mute it and pretended to be asleep. I cracked one eye open, expecting to see my mom, the only adult in the house, checking on me. but the door just stayed partially open. I waited. For minutes passed, though it felt much longer. I figured my mom had already seen me and just left the door like that. But she wasn't closing it, which left me feeling uneasy. Eventually, I got fed up and decided to quietly get out of bed to close the door myself. But as soon as I approached it, the door slammed shut. Heart. In the morning, I didn't say a word about it to my mom. I didn't want to give myself away, afraid she'd find out I was awake at that time. So I went about my day as usual, and, come nightfall, I was back at it again with my game. Just like the previous night, around 2 in the morning, the door slowly opened. Well, Josh, you know the drill, I thought, going through the routine of pretending to be asleep. One eye opened just enough to peek, and there it was again, the door, half open, with nothing else happening. This time I decided to speak up. "Mommy?" I called, faking a sleepy voice. No answer. "Mom?" I asked again, more firmly. What happened next sent shivers down my spine. A hand appeared. For fingers, pale as snow, slowly gripped the top of the door. They seemed to glow in the dark, like they were almost fluorescent. A glove, no, the dark nails gave it away. It was a real hand. It just hung there, UNMOVING. Double quotes. "Mom, is that you?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. It couldn't be her. I knew my mom never painted her nails, and these were pitch black. I called out again, and that's when another hand, identical to the first, gripped the bottom of the door. My breath hitched, and I felt the panic rising in me. I wanted to scream for my mom, but all that came out was a weak whimper. Then a third hand appeared, this one gripping the middle of the door near the handle. "Mommy?" I heard voices say, mimicking my own, but it wasn't my mom. It was multiple voices, distorted, overlapping, and mocking. I screamed. The hands instantly retreated, and the door slammed shut again with a force that rattled the room. Seconds later, my mom burst into the room, assuring me it was nothing. She didn't seem concerned at all, and I ended up sleeping in her bed that night, thinking it was over. But I was wrong. 2 nights later, I was asleep, my back pressed against my mom's chest, when I was jolted awake by a strange nose. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My eyes shot toward the door, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The fingers were back. Not just 1 or 2 hands. This time there were 10. 10 hands, their fingers tapping lightly on the door, like they were waiting. "Mom," I whispered, trying to alert her without drawing attention from whatever was on the other side. "Mom, wake up," I pleaded, gently tapping her leg. What she did next terrified me more than anything I'd ever experienced. "Just ignore it, Josh. Go to sleep," she whispered back, calm as ever. But then she draped her arm over me, like she was trying to comfort me, and when I saw her arm, I realized what had been tapping on the door all along, that it wasn't my mom. The arm covering me was as pale as snow, with those same black nails at the tips of its fingers. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was lie there, trembling uncontrollably as silent tears streamed down my face. I stayed like that for hours, too scared to make a sound, until at some point I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, my mom was up and getting ready for work, acting like everything was normal. We never spoke about it. We still haven't. Not even to this day. I moved back to my own room that same day and began barricading my door at night. It's something I have continued to do in every place I've lived, no matter where I am. No one else understands why, but I know I have to. Every night I still hear them, the faint tapping of fingers on the door. Sometimes there's a knock, and every now and then I hear that distorted voice trying to mimic me. "Mommy." I don't open the door. I can never open the door, because I know, deep down, I don't want to see what's waiting for me on the other side. I never put much stock in ghost stories. I always thought they were just made-up tales to scare people or have a laugh around a campfire. But after what I went through, I'm not so sure anymore. I don't think I'll ever be the same. It all began when I moved into an old apartment on the outskirts of town. The place was cheap and close to my job, so it seemed perfect at the time. The building was from the 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper, but it had a certain charm. The landlord seemed decent enough, and the rent was affordable. A little rough around the edges, but definitely livable. The first week went by without a hitch. I spent my evenings unpacking and getting used to the place, but soon things started getting strange. At first, it was small stuff. Doors that I knew I'd close would be open in the morning. The lights flickered unpredictably, and the floor above me creaked constantly, even though the apartment up there was empty. It could have been the quirks of an old building, but it was starting to get under my skin. Then the sounds started. It wasn't just creaking anymore. Every night around midnight, I heard something heavy being dragged across the floor above me. The noise went on for hours, right up until dawn. It was relentless, this low, grating sound, like something big being pulled across the floor. I tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just the building settling, but the sounds were too deliberate, too constant to be anything but disturbing. One night, after barely sleeping for days, I'd had enough. I needed to know what was going on, so I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check out the top floor. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight as I made my way up, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder the higher I went, until I was practically shivering by the time I reached the top. The hallway was dimly lit, with just a sliver of moonlight filtering through a filthy window at the end. All the doors were shut tight, except for one at the very end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, just enough to see that the room beyond was swallowed by darkness. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to keep going. My gut told me to turn back, but I didn't listen. I needed to know. I pushed the door open and shone my flashlight into the room. It was empty, bare walls, a dusty floor, but the cold inside was biting. There was also a faint smell in the air, like something decaying. I should have left right then and there, but I felt an odd pull, like something wanted me to step inside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped and spun around, but the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped. My flashlight flickered, then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. That's when I heard the noise again, the dragging sound, but this time it was right next to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze, paralyzed by fear. Then I felt it. Something cold and heavy brushed against my arm just for a second. It was enough to send a wave of panic through me. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. There was something in the room with me, something cold, oppressive, and dangerous. The dragging sound grew louder, more frantic, and I felt like I was being suffocated by the cold. Suddenly, a voice whispered in my head. Not a real voice, but more of a hiss, like wind through dead trees. It said one word, "Leave." That was all I needed to hear. I bolted for the door, yanking at the handle with all my strength until it finally gave way. I stumbled back into the hallway, my heart racing, and fled down the stairs without looking back. I don't remember much after that. I was too shaken, too terrified to think straight. I spent the rest of the night in my apartment, all the lights on, clutching a blanket as I sat on the couch. I must have passed out at some point, because when I woke up the sun was shining, but I didn't feel any relief. If anything, things felt worse. When I looked down, my chest was on fire. I pulled up my shirt and saw long, raw scratch marks, like something or someone had clawed at me during the night. They weren't deep, but they were fresh, and, judging by the size of the marks, whatever had done it had human-like hands. I didn't stay to find out more. I packed up my things and got out of that apartment as fast as I could. I didn't even bother telling the landlord. I just left, crashing at a friend's place until I found somewhere else to live. I've never told anyone the full story. When people ask why I moved, I just say the place didn't feel right. But the truth is, I'm still haunted by what happened, even months later. I can still feel that presence sometimes. It's as if it's watching, waiting for me to slip up. The nightmares haven't stopped either. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm being suffocated by that same cold darkness. And no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I don't know what I faced that night, but I do know one thing. There are some things in this world that can't be explained. Things that aren't just stories, and once you encounter them, they stay with you forever.